Chapter 9:21. Roddy was not in a hurry to answer. Instead, he waved at Sally on the magic tower. With the help of Edith, the latter descended from the top of the magic tower to the ground. When they saw the artifact scepter in the hands of Ifta's Duke, Roddy's importance in the hearts of the lords increased. Duke Ifta, Sally Lucifron greets my lords. She greeted them politely, but her posture was neither servile nor overbearing. After that, she did not say much. She just stood beside Roddy as a witness to this epic moment. Thank you, my lords, but I think the situation of the Kingdom of Karen can be put aside for the time being because Ifta has a very detailed plan for the future. What's important now is, as a human force, I hope to establish an alliance system with the dragons to ensure that both sides will not be invaded by the demons. Now, everyone has seen the consequences of the demon invasion. If we can't make up for it, I'm afraid the losses in the future will be even greater. Roddy's answer was obviously beyond the lords' expectations. They thought that unifying the Kingdom of Karen would be enough for this Prime Minister to be busy for a while. In the end, he simply skipped over it as if he did not care about such a result at all. Instead, he raised his vision to the safety of the continent. He did not say that he represented all the human forces on the continent, but his words implied that he was the leader of the human forces. More importantly, Roddy had the ability to find and identify the space-time rift, and this ability was something that the dragons lacked and valued. This made Roddy's status invisibly superior. Now, it was not as simple as sitting on the same level as the other dragons. However, the lords did not think that there was anything wrong with this. They looked at each other and then happily agreed. I used to think that the human alliance was dispensable, but now that something like this has happened, I'm afraid that in the future, we will need your help in many things. Picados was actually the lord who had the least contact with Roddy, but he was more direct. Don't forget about the space-time rift you promised us. I will naturally keep my promise. Roddy smiled. He had discovered this ability when he was on his way to the Holy Sanctum. He had acquired the dimensional acuity. After leaving the space-time prison, he did not think much of it. He did not expect that this inconspicuous skill would eventually become the key factor that changed the entire battle. When he realized that something was wrong with some of the space-time rifts, Lord Morlar's reaction made Roddy even more certain of his judgment. Even dragons could be unknowingly influenced by demons. All of this seemed easy, but it was actually full of danger. If Morlars had been influenced more deeply, perhaps he would have killed Roddy when he first met him. Fortunately, this spiritual invasion was not a complete control, so Roddy could immediately contact the other dragons to help him set up the trap after he was alarmed. As a human, he wanted to persuade the dragons. Of course, he could not do it with just an excuse. He promised to find at least 3 safe, space-time rifts for each lord. Now that everything had been settled, and when Quayo was stripped of his position as the leader of the dragons, the obstacles in front of Roddy had basically disappeared. So, he naturally wanted to take this opportunity to properly define the new situation. I hope that the cooperation between EFTA and the dragons will be comprehensive, because only in this way can we have more advantages in the battle against demons in the future. But now is obviously not the right time to discuss this in detail, especially when I hope that the green and red dragons will participate together, but Morlars and Lord Quayo. As Roddy spoke, he looked at the two of them. Krupus immediately said, "Before we confirm that the influence of the demons has disappeared, I think that Quayo and Morlars should not exercise any decision-making power in their race." "I agree." Victor nodded, and Picados did not have any opinion. He only asked, "Then what do we do now?" The Red Dragon's fledgling legion and the Green Dragons also need to be monitored. Morlars is more seriously affected, and his people may also be affected. After saying that, he glanced around. The members of the Red and Green Dragons who were subdued were looking at him eagerly. "I have a suggestion." It was still Roddy who broke the silence. The meeting will be held in the Imperial City a week later. At that time, I will set up a venue there to ensure that the meeting goes smoothly. In this week, I will also thoroughly investigate whether there are any traces of the demon's invasion within Ifurta's forces. On the surface, he was talking about his own arrangements, but in fact, he was reminding the other dragons to carry out an internal investigation. Of course, these lords could understand the meaning behind his word. After thinking about it, they all agreed. However, Pocatos was a little puzzled. There is still some distance from here to the Imperial City. Can your army take down the Imperial City in a week? As he said that, Krupus suddenly turned his head to look at the other side. At this moment, everyone was in the illusory territory that he created. Roddy and the others could only see boundless white. But as the Crystal Dragon Lord raised his hand and waved, a blue figure suddenly appeared in the white sky. Kardashian, who had been hovering outside the battlefield for a long time, finally entered everyone's sight. She had actually arrived outside the battlefield a long time ago, and hid her breath. At this moment she appeared, but she pretended to have just arrived here. After landing around everyone, she first greeted the other lords, then said bluntly, Ifurta's fleet suddenly appeared at the Imperial City's port. Charles II Guard's resistance was ineffective. Now the entire Imperial City is under Ifurta's control. I don't know what to do in this situation. Father, do you need me to do anything? Kardashian's acting was really good. She did not look at Roddy from the beginning to the end. She looked like she was looking for Victor to report official business. However, her words answered Pocatos's question just now. The latter was surprised after hearing it. You took it down just like that? You're fighting on two fronts? Charles II forces are all concentrated in Enrique City. My fleet and airborne troops will naturally not let go of this opportunity. Roddy first pretended to be unfamiliar with Kardashian and nodded at her coldly. Then, he calmly answered the question of the Black Dragon Hurlo. Although the lords remained silent, Kardashian's timely appearance with this information made them re-evaluate Roddy's strength. At any time, the right to speak was determined by strength. Charles II, who could only be a vassal of the dragons, was really a piece of trash compared to Roddy. Then the date of the meeting will be tentatively set for a week later. Let's tidy up the battlefield first. Victor set the tone and looked at the Crystal Dragon Lord. Krupus, I'm afraid I'll have to trouble you. The current illusion had the effect of spacetime isolation, so it could slightly reduce the effect of Quio and Morales' mental corruption. However, continuing to release this barrier was not a small burden for Krupus. He smiled bitterly. Then I guess I can only guard here. Roddy raised his hand and pointed at the magic tower behind him. The Helsinki magic tower also has a space-time array. I think the lords can try to see. If possible, it may be more suitable to let Arcanist Edith solve this task. Oh, I forgot the ability of the High Elves. Pocatos raised his eyebrows and then looked at the dejected Quio. In order to ensure your safety, Quio, I think it's better to stay in the magic tower than to be locked in this barrier, isn't it? I have no objections. At this time, Quio was no longer as strong as before. Even if he had a clear mind, he would probably be suspected if he raised any objections at this time because of the previous record of demon invasion. So, he simply did not raise any objections. Krupus and Victor looked at each other and also felt that this method was feasible. Roddy was now on the same side as them. Even if he had any evil intentions, he could not fight against the other three dragons. Most importantly, it was not suitable to imprison the two lords in any of the other dragons' forces. A third-party prison happened to be the best choice. Then let's ask Prime Minister Roddy to arrange it. Let's go into the magic tower now and confirm the effect. With a consensus, the subsequent actions were much faster. Morales and Quio, who were locked in the spherical barrier, were controlled by the three lords and floated into the magic tower. Edith locked the two of them in the prison on the 19th floor and divided the circular area into two halves, so that the two lords had sufficient space to move around. Morales was more restrained because no one could confirm whether she would transform again because of the demon's invasion. Quio, on the other hand, was much more dignified. There were no restraints on his body, and there was a basic table, chair, and bed in the room. He understood that it was already good enough for him to end up like this, so he obediently cooperated and did not say a word. Here, Krupus closed the illusion barrier outside, while Pocatos and Victor reused the magic circle to confirm the state of Quio and Morales. It turned out that the space-time isolation effect here was better, and the influence of the demon on the two was much weaker than before. But the problem was that this influence did not completely disappear. We do not expect the problem to be solved immediately. Being able to control the situation now is already the best choice. Victor glanced at his daughter, who was standing at the side with her head slightly lowered, and then glanced around. It's not time to be idle. The surrounding young dragons, green dragons, and red dragons have to be examined one by one. We must ensure that there are no members of the demon's invasion. This matter could not wait. The three lords each planned to begin the examination. In the end, before they walked out of the magic tower, an alarm sounded in Efta's camp. Roddy and Sally were stunned for a moment, and then turned to look at Edith. The latter narrowed her eyes and said, "There are enemies approaching from the southeast." Enemies? The three dragons looked at each other. At this time, what enemy could there be? Chapter 9:22. 1 kilometer away from Ifta's camp, Pope Dai Zhe was holding his scepter, his eyes fixed on the front. Dai Zhe's hand was sweaty as he held onto the reins. He knew that he had been overly nervous, but now that he had reached this distance, he was more than half relieved. If Ifta still had the strength to fight back, he would have already opened fire. The scene of Queo leading the fledgling Dragon Legion gave the Viper Cross, who had suffered heavy losses, a glimmer of hope. After a whole day of bombardment yesterday, Dai Zhe understood that Charles II had lost all ability to fight back. Even his survival was a question mark. But the appearance of the dragons today indicated that there was still hope for a comeback. The bombardment from the sky almost caused half of the Viper Cross main force to collapse, but fortunately, the cavalry was completely preserved. Because the Poison Fang chariots were destroyed, there were almost no wounded soldiers in the bombardment. After the infantry were injured, they basically died from the spreading poisonous gas. Thus, when Dai Zhe worked hard to gather the remaining knights of the Saint Army through divine arts, the logistical pressure he had to bear was not as great as he had imagined. Low morale was not a problem for the army formed by believers. Nobles and lords usually fought for their own interests, but fanatics could fight to the last man for their faith. Dai Zhe used his identity as the Pope and divine arts to boost morale. After one night, he completely gathered the remaining knights. At the same time, he sent a group of logistical troops to the battlefield to retrieve the armor and equipment from the dead Saint Army, temporarily forming an infantry unit of 2,000 people. Saddles or blankets were placed on the horses of the logistical troop. Although these temporary infantry could not become qualified cavalry, they could use the horses to increase their movement speed and quickly enter the battlefield. Thus, overnight, he managed to pull together a team of 2,000 infantrymen and 2,000 cavalrymen through a temporary leadership team. Dai Zhe knew that the combat power of the troops formed this way could not be compared to before, but he actually had no other choice. If he directly retreated, then Ifta's army would completely rule the entire kingdom of Karen. As a member of the Rose Cross, and also known as the White Sickle, how could Sally and Duke allow the Viper Cross to continue existing? Speaking of hiding, Dai Zhe could not escape with a large number of believers. Heading east into the mountains? Countless people had used their blood and tears to prove how dangerous that place was. Even if he brought the elders along with him, it would still be a disaster. Furthermore, those powerful elders and cardinal bishops had all been blasted into smithereens by yesterday's explosion. Now, only 2 Saint Knights who were slightly more powerful were by his side. If Efta's position was still stable, he definitely wouldn't have rushed up so recklessly. But when he saw the red dragons and the green dragons fighting, and then a large number of magic spells plowed through Efta's position, Dai clearly saw that the cannons that had previously bombarded Enrique City were all damaged and overturned, and even after a long time, no soldiers came out to repair or move them. He was sure that the soldiers at Efta's camp had suffered heavy losses. Most of them were dead or injured, and they couldn't care less about defending. In fact, Dai's conclusion was not wrong if he were to observe from outside the battlefield, because Krupas's illusory boundary had indeed shown such a scene to the outside world. Those red and green dragons that rushed into the boundary were actually captured alive by the ice dragons lying in ambush on the ground. But as a bystander, what Dai saw was the scene of the dragons killing each other and the destruction of the camp. He did not rush up impulsively because the sudden appearance of the magic tower was too intimidating. But when he saw the magic tower collapsing under Morales' attack, the Pope finally clenched his fists. After experiencing the fear of the plane bombing, Dai no longer dared to gather his troops together. He had long ordered the cavalry to be divided into 8 platoons. The infantrymen rode behind the cavalry, creating a long gap in front, back, left, and right. They advanced in batches with 6 teams of more than 200 people. Boom! The demon tower in his field of vision let out a deafening explosion when it fell to the ground. He saw that there were finally a large number of Efta soldiers shouting and running away. The corpses of the giant dragons were scattered. Such a scene really brought a strong impact to people, but Dai felt that his blood was constantly rushing to his brain. Now's the time. As long as he went forward and helped the giant dragons defeat Efta, he might be able to replace Charles II and even become the nominal ruler of the kingdom of Karen in the future. Approach slowly. He asked the temporarily appointed adjutant to signal. The flag embroidered with the symbol of the viper and the cross began to wave forward rhythmically. The surrounding cavalry and infantrymen responded with small flags. This was indeed more well-trained than the armies of the ordinary nobles. Dai took a deep breath. Looking at the ruins in front of him, he held up a scroll that he had prepared a long time ago. It was an ancient scroll of divine power, a sacred relic that had been passed down since the founding of the sect. Although it could not be compared to the Viper's Kiss, which was an item left behind by a real god, it was still one of the highest-level items passed down in the Church. It was created by the third Pope, Brenzel, when he was at the peak of his power. His level of magic was only one step away from that of a demigod. He was the most powerful mage in the history of the Viper Cross. This scroll was called Viper's Protection. Dai did not know its specific effect. He only knew that when the previous pope described it, it was defined as an item that can only be used in a battle of life and death. Obviously, this was a battle of life and death for the Viper Cross. Therefore, he did not hesitate to use this trump card left behind by the Church. When the scroll burned and disappeared with the light of the magic, a waterfall of light fell from the sky and immediately splashed on all the cavalry charging at the front. After seeing the miserable state of Efta's camp, the Saint Army's morale was already high. Now that the light fell, all of them fell into a state of fanaticism. The war horses under them began to collectively accelerate. Everyone's armor was covered with a layer of faint golden light. The spears and swords in their hands were the same. As the effect of the magic continued, illusory snakes appeared in the gaps of the cavalry. Their bodies were more than 5 meters long, and their bodies were covered in stripe. As the cavalry approached the camp, the number of snakes transformed by the light increased. Beside each cavalry, there were 3 to 4 giant snakes following them. In the dust, These more than 6,000 snakes combined with the momentum of the cavalry charging forward like a huge wave, heading straight for Efta's camp. Dai Ze did not expect this scroll to be so powerful. This was actually the group version of the high-level Viper's Protection. He could only cast it on a small team. The power of the condensed snakes was amazing. When facing the infantry, they could almost ignore defense and cause great damage. With these 2,000 cavalrymen and thousands of snakes, their combat power could be said to have increased by several times. Looking at the camp that was less than 500 meters in front of him, he gritted his teeth and finally asked his adjutant to raise the flag of "Everyone charge." At this moment, everyone saw a thick white fog floating in front of them without warning. The cavalry had already accelerated. The fog in front of them only floated for a few dozen meters before completely dissipating. However, when Dai Ze rushed out of the fog, he found that the camp in front of him had suddenly changed. The magic tower was still standing there. The fleeing Ifurta soldiers had completely disappeared. Even the corpses of the dragon fledglings and the charred ground that had been plowed by spells were nowhere to be seen. They could only see the battle-ready position, countless red and green giant dragons bound by spells, and the other dragons beside them who were turning their heads to look at them. Under the sunlight there was the crystal dragon that was glistening, the frost dragon that was brightly colored, and the muscular black dragon Hurlo. There were more than 60 of them. In order to subdue the red and green dragons that were fighting, they had been lying in ambush under Krupus's illusion barrier. At this moment, facing the thousands of humans who were charging forward with magic, there was only doubt in their eyes. "Iskar, what's going on with them?" Eshin asked the bound Iskar. Although the two of them were comrades, under the Lord's orders, they did not hesitate to take action. But now, seeing these cavalrymen charging forward like the wind, the red dragon Iskar, who was lying on the ground, was also puzzled. "I don't know. Are they crazy? I've been busy the whole day, so there are fewer updates today. Sorry." Chapter 923. Most of the dragons scattered on the battlefield were at the outer perimeter of Ifta's trench. If the cavalry were to attack, the dragons would be the first to be attacked. It was the first time in their lives that the dragons saw humans who dared to charge at them on horseback. Hence, they did not know what to do. On the magic tower, the 3 dragons had already arrived at the top, looking down at this absurd yet real scene. Roddy was the one who knew the most and had personally participated in the planning of this encirclement. He immediately realized what was going on and said bluntly, "The Viper Cross must have misjudged the situation due to the illusion and wanted to take advantage of the situation to secure victory." As soon as he finished speaking, the cannons of Ifta's camp suddenly fired in unison. From the top of the tower, the impact of the cannonballs landing on the cavalry formation could be clearly seen. Although the Viper's Protection could not block the crystal cannons, it could greatly suppress the impact of the cannons. Moreover, the cavalry did not form a group and attacked in small group. The lack of cannons in Ifta's camp immediately became obvious. Even the powerful double-barreled crystal cannons had limited damage to the cavalry. After 2 rounds of firing with the cannons, they had only killed over 200 enemies, and the enemy had already rushed to within 200 meters. However, before coming into contact with the Ifta soldiers, the cavalry first had to face the dragons that covered the ground. "How arrogant!" Victor said in a flat tone, but the chill that suddenly swept out instantly enveloped the entire battlefield. The frost mirror aura slowed down all the cavalries within a kilometer. Victor's action also meant that the dragons had declared war on the Victor clan. The frost dragon race at the front seemed to have received an order. They turned their heads and shot a large wave of dragon breath at the cavalry. At the same time, they raised their dragon claws and began to block the cavalry that advanced under the Viper's Protection, like swatting flies. At the same time, Krupus's wall of illusion caused a large number of cavalry to tighten their reins in panic. Countless horses could not withstand the force and broke their legs, falling to the ground. Picasto raised his hand and created a huge trench that was 3 meters wide and more than 10 meters deep outside the trench. Many cavalry and infantry that were advancing at the back could not dodge in time and fell into the trench. "This is the first time I've seen a human charging at dragons," Picasto sneered. His words were also telling Roddy the reason for the dragon's attack. Dragons would not take the initiative to participate in human battles, but if someone took the initiative to attack dragons, then there was nothing much to say. Seeing the cavaliers who dodged the dragons and all kinds of spells approaching the camp, Sally, who had been watching from the side, looked at the gigantic viper brought by the viper's protection. She thought for a moment and raised her left hand. The 3 vipers materialized and climbed onto the viper's kiss in her hand. The next moment, the image of the scepter reverted to the form of 3 coiling snakes, and the vast aura of the scepter shook violently along with Sally's ordinary illumination spell. An invisible wave spread down from the top of the tower. When it came into contact with the snake shadows of the viper's protection, the originally ferocious snake shadows stopped in an instant. Then, without hesitation, they turned their heads and bit at the cavaliers beside them. The dragon's spells had already caused the cavaliers to suffer greatly. Now that the viper's protection suddenly turned against them, they were like waves slapping on the beach. All of them stopped a few dozen meters away from the camp. The power of the wave was too strong, causing the expressions of the few lords to change. They already knew that Sally had a divine scepter in her hand, but the power of a divine weapon in the hands of a mortal didn't make them think much of it. However, this simple illumination spell made them realize once again that Epherta, their master in name, was far more than just a vase. The reason behind this was very simple. No matter how powerful the demigod-level dragon's spells were, they still had to abide by the laws of this world and couldn't overstep them. But any of Sally's divine spells, even if they didn't have much power, were cast on the laws of this world. In other words, even if Quio used all his strength to cast a shield, Sally could easily break it with the power of the scepter. They originally thought that they were the strongest force on the continent, but in terms of the level of spells, these demigod-level lords were actually a head lower than Sally, who had the scepter. Realizing this, the 3 lords finally realized that Roddy's Force was on par with the dragons, and it wasn't climbing up the social ladder at all. The moment Pope Dai disappeared from the illusion, his heart was like dead ashes. The cavalry he led were now trapped in front of the wall of illusion. No matter what scrolls or dispel magic the Pope used, there was only a burning wall of fire in front of him. And the terrifying thing about this illusion was that the soldiers who tried to force their way through would really be burned. The level of the dragon's spells was so high that these people's brains would cause their bodies to feel the corresponding sensations, which could even lead to death. Dai understood that his decision this time was completely wrong. He could only forcibly gather the nearby cavalry and immediately put up the flag of retreat. In this situation, there was no point in fighting to the death. Dai turned his horse around and began to escape. At the same time, in order to avoid the possible bombardment, he deliberately took a snake-shaped escape route. The wall of illusion didn't cover a large area. After retreating for more than 30 meters, the surrounding scenery returned to normal. Dai saw the infantry formation that was moving forward at the back and hurriedly adjusted his direction, passing through the middle of 2 of the squads. The terrifying bombardment at the front line had already caused the infantry to hesitate. Now that they saw the flag of their commander turn around and escape, the morale of these temporarily armed infantry immediately collapsed. Without the need for the bombardment, the scattered squads began to run in all directions. Dai had already cast all the divine spells in the scepter, so his troops' speed was much faster than the other cavalry. At the same time, all of them had a faint golden halo and shield around them. After running for 300 meters, a small caliber shell from Ifta's camp landed on the side of the troop. But under the protection of the strong and dense shield, only one knight in the troop was blown off his horse. The others were still safe and sound and continued to move forward. This scene made Dai Ze feel slightly relieved. However, before running for 500 meters, he suddenly saw a huge circular pattern on the ground in front of him. This is, Dai Ze, who was on horseback, suddenly turned his head and found that this pattern was caused by the light shining from the top of the magic tower. No matter where the whole troop went, the circle with a diameter of about 50 meters followed like a shadow. Dai Ze suddenly had an ominous premonition. At the same time, he realized that the chaotic sounds of cannons on the battlefield had all stopped. On Ifta's fort, the cannons that could still fire were quickly adjusting the direction of the barrels. The soldiers used their rangefinders to track the constantly moving pattern in the distance. The platoon leader's urging voices were continuous. "Don't calculate ahead, aim at the circle and fire. If you miss at this distance, I won't forgive you. Squad 2 is ready. Squad 3 is ready. Fire!" Like thunder, hundreds of shells did not aim in all directions this time, but collectively flew towards the escaping troop more than 600 meters away. Boom, boom, boom. The troop of more than 40 cavalrymen was instantly drowned in the flames of the explosion. The three lords standing on top of the magic tower watched this scene. Although they did not say anything, they obviously had the same doubt. If they were the ones standing there, would they be able to withstand this wave of bombardment? They could dodge it, but if they were to take it head-on, their shields would definitely not be able to withstand this round of bombardment. As for how many shells their bodies could withstand, their feelings were no different from Quayo's. It is very difficult for humans to compare with demonic creatures in melee combat. I believe that all the lords must have a common understanding of this. Therefore, in the future, when facing the demonic army, this battle method will replace the simplest human wave tactic. Roddy felt like he was Stark at the beginning of Iron Man, showing the power of tactical missiles to others. The dense black mushroom cloud was now in everyone's field of vision, making the best footnote for his words. This tactic, I call it firepower coverage. Simple, crude, but effective. The smoke dispersed. Pope Dai Ze, who had been covered in shields and buffs, had completely disappeared along with his guards and deputies. In the future, Ifta's army will be equipped with more crystal cannons. There will be models with larger caliber, stronger firepower, longer range, and more accurate models. Not only will it be used on the army, but it will also be used on the Air Force and Navy. The demonic invasion is probably not limited to land creatures. The ancient beasts are the best example. To be able to attack the enemy from all directions and cause a destructive blow, this is my vision for the future human army. This was actually the military system of the Earth's army, sea, and air forces. However, he would not talk about strategic weapons and satellites at the moment. Just the appearance of firearms was enough to make these dragons realize that the era of change had arrived. The three lords in front of him were silent for a long time. Finally, Pokatos spoke. "How did you think of these things? The High Elves have controlled the rechargeable crystal for more than 200 years, but I have never seen them make something like this. Do you remember?" He turned to look at Victor, who shook his head. The rechargeable crystal of the High Elves has made great progress in magic formation technology, but most of them follow the arcane system, only greatly enhanced and improved. They are mainly energy attacks. I remember that before the war, long-range physical attacks had just appeared. Chapter 924. Roddy nodded in agreement. Of course, he would not say that Kardashian had developed all these with the technology from Earth. Yes, it's a pity that the High Elves did not popularize these tactics. They still rely on cold weapons from the old era to fight against the demons. The High Elves are too arrogant. In front of the demonized beastmen, they do not have an advantage in terms of population. Under the influence of the mana tide, the Arcanists cannot even up the advantage. Krupus did not seem to want to talk more, but he seemed to be in a good mood. This was because the things that Roddy had shown made him optimistic about the threat of the demons in the future. Let them clean up the battlefield. Let's go back first. This was the first time Roddy had heard of the concept of the mana tide. He wanted to ask a few more questions, but he thought that this was not a suitable time to talk about the High Elves, so he did not say anything and followed the High Elves to the core room below. The crystal walls of the core room monitored all parts of the battlefield. Seeing the lords coming down, Edith walked down from the control circle in the center and said, "Lord Morales has just woken up." This news immediately made them rush to the outside of the cage on the 19th floor. Morales, who was bound by the magic circle and chains, was silent at the moment. The previous battle had torn her dress, but now the vines had grown again and more or less restored her original appearance. However, her messy long hair and slightly haggard expression could not be concealed. The three lords did not say a word. They immediately activated the magic circle to confirm Morales' current condition again. Then they found that only a small part of the halo showed the demon's blackish-purple color. This meant that the state of Morales' mind corruption had mostly recovered. Is it because of the space-time isolation? No, it should be the power of the divine gear. Victor answered Pocato's question and pointed at Sally, who was behind him at the same time. In the cage, Morales nodded. I feel the power of the law. It makes me feel much better. Her jade-green eyes looked at Sally. Because her body was trapped, she could only nod to express her gratitude. Then, she looked at Roddy. Right now, I should be thanking the humans the most. If not for them, the entire green dragon race would have fallen into the abyss. Roddy looked at the wounds on Morlar's cheeks. The wounds were caused by the magic tower controlled by Edith. However, Morlar's was magnanimous and did not show any resentment. Roddy was relieved and nodded to accept Morlar's gratitude. After that, Roddy decided to remain silent, because now was the time to decide Morales' future fate. He would leave the internal affairs of the dragons to resolve. Morales, do you remember what you did? Krupus asked directly. The latter nodded happily. I remember. I still remember how I did all these things in my mind. But I have never felt anyone change my way of thinking. I never thought of breaking up the alliance. I just felt jealous of the alliance led by Ko. The emotions that were derived from this made me do so many wrong things. That's right. After saying that, she sighed. Now that I think about it, it should be because of the space-time rift. Following Morales' narration, everyone finally understood the reason why she was corrupted by the demons. Compared to other dragons, green dragons who stayed in the deep mountains and forests all year round had a higher probability of discovering the hidden space-time rift. In the process of studying them, there were a few with larger energy and size. Naturally, Morales, the Lord, had to deal with them personally. After 3 or 4 years of this research, she unknowingly changed her way of thinking. If it wasn't for the change in my way of thinking, I definitely wouldn't have attended the meeting held by Quio in the Imperial City. Because I have no interest in the so-called alliance itself. Quio, who was standing in the opposite cell, also chimed in. My emotions seemed to have come from my jealousy of Victor. At first, I just didn't want to see him have a human as an ally. But once the thought arose, I had a reason to do a lot of things later. Although Quio's symptoms were not as serious as Morales, his temper was indeed more emotional than other dragons. So it was not surprising that he was taken advantage of. The other lords looked at each other. Through the narration of the two, they knew that the demons no longer used the whispering and instigating method to guide their targets to do things. Their methods were more invisible and harder to detect. If it weren't for Roddy's keen senses as a witcher, this hidden danger would probably have remained. It was conceivable that if this trend was allowed to continue, when the demons came again, it would be unknown how many dragons would be left. This kind of fear sent a chill down the backs of the lords. Fortunately, the disaster was stopped before it happened. At the same time, everyone had the advantage of information. The current situation is that we know about the existence of this kind of space-time rift. Since the demons can affect us through our minds, then, is it possible to fight back? Roddy was a little curious about how far the dragons had reached in the field of space-time. But to his disappointment, the three lords looked at each other. Victor shook his head and said, "Our way of using the space-time rift is still very preliminary. At present, we can only use the concept of storing and stripping space-time energy. We have always wanted to do a reverse invasion, but at present, the crystal dragons can only reverse input some information about the illusion. Krupus should be the lord with the most in-depth research, but he stopped there." At this point, Roddy looked back at Edith. The latter nodded and added, "I have a little research on space-time. If possible, I can provide more assistance in this area." The space-time barrier that Edith had cast before had almost completely isolated the subsequent influence of the demons on Quio and Morales. The power displayed by the Hersino magic tower was enough for the lords to recognize her. "We will talk about these things in a week. The problem now is we have to carefully investigate whether there are any compatriots whose minds have been corrupted by the demons. Including the young dragons, no one can be left behind." After Pocatos finished speaking, he glanced at Quio and Morales. "As for the green and red dragons, the most important thing now is the handover of power and follow-up cooperation. Tell me where the successors are, and the three of us will invite them at the same time. After that, we will hold a handover ceremony here. How about it?" This was also to save face for the two. Quio and Morales now had no room to refuse. They both nodded in agreement and gave the list of alternate elders of the dragons. At this point, the arrangements of the dragons were roughly confirmed. Krupus suggested that they leave separately, but Victor added, "Efta sacrificed a lot in this battle. The ice dragons will provide 2,000 high-quality magic crystal as an additional thank you." As the lord who first bet on Roddy, Victor was the one who could best read the situation. Now that the situation had changed, the dragons could no longer treat Efta with the attitude of making friends. He took the initiative to express goodwill and communicate with him on an equal footing. The mystical crystals were secondary as this was the best response to Roddy. Sure enough, his proposal was approved by the other dragons, including Quio and Morales. They expressed their willingness to support the human magic construction in all aspects. Roddy accepted all of this and did not refuse. The three lords then left, and the magic tower was restored to silence. Standing outside the prison that was divided into two semicircles, Roddy could see the current posture of the two dragons' lords. Quio's face was lonely and dispirited, his eyes staring at the ground, not knowing what to think. The restraints on Morales' body had been removed, but there was not much expression on her face. When she sat there calmly, even her breathing became extremely long, like an old tree that had grown roots. Duke and Sally breathed a sigh of relief. The meeting between the dragons' lords was not as difficult as they had imagined, but it was very exhausting to maintain composure under that kind of atmosphere. Roddy himself already had the aura of the dragons, so he did not care. He reached out and hugged Sally. Feeling her relaxed body, Roddy comforted her. "The war is over. You can relax for a while. Finally, this day has come." Sally could not help but sigh, and then looked at Edith, who suddenly said, "Prime Minister Roddy, Lord Morales seems to have something to say." Roddy, who was planning to leave, looked up and found that Morales' eyes were looking at him. "I can feel the emotions in my mind at that time. When they saw you, they seemed to have extremely obvious hatred and mania. You have to be careful, they may use more means to deal with you." "I will." Chapter 925. Things in the magic tower had ended, but things on the battlefield had not. In this decisive battle, the only thing Ifta did from the beginning to the end was to cover fire. Even the royal troops and the Viper Cross in Enrique City were reduced to ashes in the flames. But this did not mean that the battle was over. The retreat of the enemy meant that the resistance had disappeared. Ifta still had to occupy, reorganize, dispose of the corpses, clean up the battlefield, and rebuild after the battle. The end of May was a hot time, and the corpses on the battlefield rotted very quickly. Most of the soldiers of the Viper Cross who had been poisoned were left naked on the battlefield because their comrades had stripped them of their armor and weapons. It would not be an exaggeration to describe such a scene as corpses everywhere. After the death of Pope Daize, the leaderless army completely collapsed. But these exiled soldiers were a threat to the entire region. Roddy had already ordered the Rose Cross troops, who had been preparing for many days, to encircle the surrounding areas and ensure the safety of other towns and villages. Ifta's own troops, on the other hand, set out unhurriedly for Enrique City the next day. This time, it was the gigantic arcane puppet that led the charge. The compacted road allowed the subsequent artillery carriages to follow, and it took 2 hours for the 4 arcane puppets to move at full speed to cover a distance of less than 2 kilometers. When the soldiers arrived at the city, there were only 3 or 4 heads left on the city wall. There was no city gate here because the entire northern city wall had collapsed in the artillery fire. The soldiers could only see the ruins and countless corpses buried underneath. Those who remained in the city were the lucky survivors. Sodeler stationed the troops outside the city and waited for the arcane puppets to build the road to the royal city. "Commander, do we really not need to surround those escaping nobles?" In a simple tent set up outside the city, the advisors were all smiles as they held a post-war statistical report. But now they were more concerned about the whereabouts of the country's former ruler, Charles II. The Falcons have been monitoring them. With Crone and the other mages escorting them, there's no point in chasing after them now. Sodeler made a mark on the plan that he had flipped through countless times. The people brought by the fleet have already begun to plan a new plan for the construction of the port. Where else can this monarch go? In fact, Charles II, who was on the run, did not have much ability to think. "Your Majesty, the Imperial City is our last barrier. With the help of the magicians of the Dragon Tower and the magicians, Efta's weapons will no longer be a threat." Count Val, his face covered with grease and dust, kept giving advice to Charles II. "Oh, let's talk when we get there." The king of the kingdom of Karen looked haggard at the moment. He was sweating profusely as he rode on his horse. Looking up at the cloudless sky, the figure of the falcon was hovering in the sky. They were already used to the buzzing sound of the propellers. At this moment, they no longer saw it as a threat. They were afraid of the albatross, but the latter never showed up. After Quio left Enrique City, the boundary that protected them suddenly disappeared at a certain moment. After climbing up the city wall and seeing that Efta's position was finally intact, Crone immediately joined the remaining 3 magicians and 6 mages to escort the nobles out of the southern city gate. Charles II did not give many orders during this process. He even thought of killing himself by ramming his head against the Enrique city wall. This would be more satisfying than facing a situation where everything was lost. Half of the remaining nobles expressed their willingness to stay behind and buy time for Charles II to escape. Of course, Charles II did not know that these people chose to surrender after the Efta infantry division arrived. At this time, the people who were fleeing could basically become the core of this kingdom. More than 12 nobles gathered a guard of 70 to 80 people, and together with Charles II and the mages, they fled from the southern city wall to the imperial city. After running for a whole day, they finally arrived at a village 5 kilometers away from the imperial city. At this time, the villagers here still did not know what had happened. They were only surprised by such a group of nobles who were in a sorry state but were dressed in gorgeous clothes. "Your Majesty, do you need to rest for a while?" Magician Crone was also exhausted. Even if he could use spells to reduce the burden of the warhorse, riding for more than 10 hours continuously was a great test of stamina. Even if he could not stand to use spells to float midway, it was inevitable that he would be tired and haggard at this moment. No need to rest, let's go. Looking at the city not far away, the hungry Charles II decided to continue on his way. The sooner he returned to the city, the sooner the panic brought about by the artillery fire could be eliminated. Although he did not know what he could do after returning, the city could still give him a sense of security. Everyone, let's work harder. We're almost back to the Imperial City. Count Val had done his best along the way. He was still some distance away from the core sequence, but this war had made him feel that he had found an opportunity. After a brief adjustment, the group continued to speed up toward the Imperial City. It only took them half an hour to travel the 5 kilometers, but as he gazed at the silent city walls and the tightly shut gates, Charles II felt an indescribable pressure. Who is it? The soldier on the city wall was not tall, and his loose clothes could not cover his thin body. Even his voice sounded weak. Below, Count Val immediately brought out the name of Charles II and asked to open the gate. The soldier was shocked and hurriedly said, "Okay." With a creaking sound, the suspension bridge of the Imperial City moat was lowered, and after the wide city gate opened, the deserted street was a world of difference from when they left. Magician Crone frowned and said, "That's not right, there should be mages on the city wall." But he and Strange and the others behind him were only suspicious, and did not think about the possibility of the city falling. The long-distance raid had exhausted these mages who had not experienced war. Their lips were chapped, and at this moment, they just wanted to find a place to drink water and rest. Seeing the city gate open, Charles II finally let out a long breath. Even though his buttocks and thighs hurt badly, he tried his best to bear it and quickly led more than a dozen nobles into the city. "Where are they? Hey! You stop, where are the city guards? Where are the mages on duty?" Count Val also noticed something strange, but the thin soldier in front of him shook his head and retreated. "My lord, I don't know anything. Why are you running? Come here and talk." Val still wanted to say something, but the soldier turned and ran, leaving the nobles who had just entered the city to look at each other. In the next moment, a whistling arrow was suddenly shot into the air. Amidst the sharp whistling sound, a large number of figures suddenly surged out from the surroundings. Clattering sounds of metal armors colliding resounded. When Charles II realized that these soldiers were fully clad in metal armors and wielding charged spears, his face instantly turned as pale as a sheet of paper. "You, whose army are you?" This was actually nonsense, because everyone saw the wolf head mark on the soldier's armor. But even if they were surrounded, it was hard for them to imagine why the enemy would appear here. Clang! The sound of chains closing the city gate and the drawbridge being pulled made these people understand that they had no way out, but the surrounding soldiers were not in a hurry to attack. They just formed a semicircle and maintained a distance of about 30 meters and did not move forward. For Charles II and the others, who were all riding horses, this incomplete encirclement of infantry was really vulnerable, but what made them not dare to move were the crystal cannons set up on the streets not far away. For those who had experienced the power of cannon fire, even their breathing became cautious when such weapons were pointed at them at close range. Fortunately, Crone and the other archmages immediately began to release shields and boundaries. Rays of light flashed, and just as Charles II had the courage to continue speaking, he saw the air in front of him suddenly distort, and a strangely shaped black tower suddenly appeared on the wide street. The image of the Hersino magic tower was not unfamiliar to them, but the scene in front of them was really hard for Charles II to accept. He pulled out his long sword and murmured, "Fake! It's all fake! This must be an illusion created by magic. Crone, quickly destroy all of this." However, Crone did not move. He had observed the magic tower in front of him at close range when he was in Elson, and could certainly understand what it meant at this moment. Looking back at Strange and the other mages, he happily dismounted from his horse and waved his hand to remove the original shields and boundaries. "Your Majesty, forgive our incompetence, but this magic tower can't even deal with the dragons. Impossible. All of this is fake." Charles II pulled out his longsword. Although he tried to make his voice as loud as possible in the quiet battlefield, this kind of words that appeared tough but was actually weak showed his timidity. He looked forward to a response from the nobles behind him, and then everyone would charge together. Even if they died, they would die a heroic death. However, Charles II did not have the courage to charge, and the nobles around him had also lost the determination to fight to the death. Being aimed at by 8 crystal cannons and a magic tower in front of him, he could not escape. What other choice did he have except to surrender? At this moment, the door at the bottom of the magic tower opened, and Roddy and Sally, who was dressed in formal attire, stepped down. The soldiers in front of them slowly parted to both sides. Sally walked in front and Roddy followed from the side. When Duke stood still, Roddy still did not stand parallel to her. This was a dialogue between the royal family and the Lucifron family. Although he was in charge of the entire war, the end of the grudge was still left to Sally. Chapter 926. I underestimated your courage. Charles II stared resentfully at Roddy, but the latter ignored him and directly greeted Crone and the others. Elson, we haven't seen each other for a few months. How are you all? Crone, Strange, and Scarlet did not know whether to laugh or cry. There was no way they could respond to such words. In the end, they could only shake their heads helplessly. It's all right. After the matter is over, the Magic Research Department will still be willing to welcome you. After Roddy said this, he turned his gaze to Charles II. Aren't you worried about your wife and children? Charles II, who was still brewing his emotions, suddenly froze, because his mind was indeed full of how to escape here just now. He had never thought that his wife and children were still in the city. At this moment, after being reminded by Roddy, he suddenly opened his eyes wide. What did you do? Where are Solis and Brazsak? He only asked where the 2 princes were and did not ask about the queen and daughter. This really made Roddy feel disgusted. He rolled his eyes. Guess. Charles II was furious, but he did not dare to flare up. Thinking that the mages in the team had given up resistance, he also understood that he had completely failed, but the unwillingness in his heart made him clench the hilt of his sword. Many unrealistic ideas also emerged in his mind. If he rushed over now, was it possible to directly kill Sally or Roddy? Sally looked at his flickering eyes and calmly said, The kingdom of Karen has shed enough blood. It is time for the war to end. Charles II's face was livid. If he did not move, the other nobles would not dismount. At this moment, if he wanted to launch a charge and resist, the remaining nobles would most likely follow, because this moment concerned the dignity and reputation of the entire family. If anyone opened their mouth to surrender first, the entire family would bear the blame. However, Charles II could not make this decision. The situation was somewhat deadlocked, but Roddy was not in a hurry. In his eyes, Charles II was only an emperor with great ambitions but little talent. If he had the courage to make the decision to destroy indiscriminately, the situation in the kingdom of Karen would not have become like this. At this moment, the choice was in his hands. He could decide the life and death of the other party at will. However, just as he was about to end the conversation, a fluctuation from above made him suddenly raise his head. At this moment, Charles II saw the dragon slayer mark light up in Roddy's eyes, followed by a whistling sound coming from the sky. He raised his head to look at the sky and was shocked to find that there were actually 5 giant dragons descending in circles. Charles II didn't know what was going on, but he remembered that Lord Keo had protected him back then. He disregarded the pain in his crotch and hurriedly dismounted. The 5 dragons were of different colors. Kardashian, who was the first to land, turned into her human form and landed on the periphery of the crowd. Charles II remembered that she was familiar with his daughter, rolling, and immediately said, "Your Excellency Kardashian, you're finally here." Kardashian, who was looking at Roddy, was stunned for a moment when she heard that. After she realized what was going on, she rolled her eyes at Roddy. "They just arrived? I thought it would be over in the morning." After saying that, she greeted Sally. "This crown of yours is a little stingy. I'll change it to a more beautiful one for the coronation." "Really? That's great," Sally responded with a smile. This scene immediately stunned Charles II and the nobles behind him. Charles II, who was about to complain, swallowed his saliva. He felt that the dragons seemed to be playing a big joke on him. "Why are they all here?" Roddy glanced over. Kardashian was the first to land, and the other 4 dragons behind her turned into their human forms and came before him. He saw 2 familiar faces and raised his hand to greet them. "Your Excellency Iskar, Your Excellency Eshin, I'm really sorry that I didn't get to greet you before." "No need to address us as Your Excellency, Prime Minister Roddy. Just call us by our names in private." Eshin did not say much. He pointed to Iskar, who had his head lowered beside him. "This guy is sure that he's fine, so he's coming out to report the news." Roddy knew this would be the result. He was about to speak when he saw Iskar bow to him. "What happened before was really offensive. I apologize to EFTA on behalf of the Red Dragons. I understand. There's no need to be like this." Roddy quickly reached out to help him up and then looked at the other 2. The Black Dragon Hurlo was a strong man who was 2 meters tall, and the Green Dragon was a short male elf who was about 1.7 meters tall. Rubens and Stika. Kardashian introduced the 2. The 2 young dragons were a little curious about Roddy. They were not as polite as Iskar and just nodded to greet him. Roddy greeted them and turned to ask Kardashian, "Isn't it arranged in a week? Why are you here today?" "We're here on behalf of our lords to inform you that 2 elders of the Green Dragons have symptoms of mental attack. At the same time, there are more than 30 ordinary members who are slightly affected. The Red Dragons are not doing well either. There are more than 20 of them with mild symptoms. At the same time, some of the young dragons are also affected. Fortunately, this incident happened. Otherwise, the future would be unpredictable." Kardashian glanced at Charles II and the others. "When are you going to finish? We're here to make some preparations in advance, so that the venue for the meeting is too shabby. The lords are very concerned about this matter. However, since the venue is arranged in the capital, you'll naturally be in charge. If there's anything you need help with, just let us know. If there's anything important that needs to be notified, we can also contact the lords in time. Let's do it in the central square. We'll discuss the details later." Roddy did not take it seriously at all because the content of the meeting was the main point. He knew that the current situation was actually the dragons fighting to be on his good side. He was good at taking advantage of the situation. After thinking for a while, he immediately said, "That's good. I have something to discuss with the lords. However, there were too many things yesterday, so I didn't have the time to talk about it." In fact, he had this idea yesterday. However, the red and green dragons had not been replaced yet. This kind of thing was not suitable to be brought up in front of the other lords. Iskar and Eshin were also a little curious. The former asked, "What's the matter?" Roddy turned back and waved at the magic tower. He whispered, "Let it out." The next moment, a dark purple figure suddenly appeared at the top of the magic tower. A hoarse dragon roar sounded. The shadow dragons spread their wings, circled around, and swooped down towards Roddy. After landing with a loud rumble, the ferocious-looking dragons obediently lay beside Roddy. By chance, I found it imprisoned in a magic tool. Roddy looked at the few dragons who looked surprised. Kardashian's surprise was fake. Without her help, it would be difficult for Roddy to tame this shadow dragon. Roddy continued, there are no signs of demonic invasion on its body. I think this may be the last shadow dragons. I hope to inform the lords of this news. If possible, I hope to discuss this matter in a week's time. This news obviously exceeded the expectations of Iskar and the others. Rubens and Stika, who were originally calm, looked at the shadow dragon in surprise. Then, they looked at each other and said, we will inform the lords now. You guys go first. I still have something to say. Kardashian asked them to leave first. So, the 4 dragons immediately transformed and left the imperial city. The news of the shadow dragon was too shocking. They all wanted to inform the lords as soon as possible. After they left, Kardashian heaved a sigh of relief. She relaxed and said, the green dragon and red dragon have each picked a new lord. This matter is too rushed. The new lord should not cause too much trouble in a short period of time. It's good that everything is stable. A solid alliance is 10,000 times better than a total collapse. Roddy turned his head and said to the shadow dragon, if you want to fly, go circle a few times. Just don't attack any creatures. The shadow dragon obediently hissed and flapped its wings to fly into the sky. It was not like the other dragons who used magic to fly into the sky. Therefore, the strong wind caused by the flapping of its wings directly blew Charles II and the others around. But at this time, they could no longer care about their image. Everything that happened in front of them was completely beyond their understanding. Since when did dragons become so polite to humans? And that shadow dragon, why did it look like Roddy was its master? Kardashian's behavior was casual and intimate. In addition to the words she said to Sally, this group of self-proclaimed smart nobles naturally understood what it meant. Charles II felt as if there was a fire burning in his innards. He tried to please the red dragons in every possible way, and in the end, he did not even hesitate to hand over the control of the entire army. But in the end, the entire army was still defeated. Even the red dragon lord himself couldn't turn the situation around. This kind of defeat, where he worked like a horse and lost everything, was a world of difference from Roddy, who was in control of everything. What do you plan to do? Do you still want to stay here? Kardashian looked at them impatiently. Under such urging, Charles II had no choice but to make a stand. He gritted his teeth and pulled out his sword, not to fight, but to hold it with both hands. Handing over the sword meant surrender, and the surrounding nobles lowered their heads. But there was nothing to criticize about Charles II's behavior. In the face of Roddy, who was on an equal footing with the dragons, this team of 100 people could not do anything at all. But the king wanted to say something, but in the end, he gritted his teeth and remained silent. For a former ruler, admitting his own failure was an extremely humiliating thing. Holding the scepter in her hand, Sally stepped forward. She raised her gaze and looked at Charles II in front of her. She raised her hand and grasped the gem-studded longsword. She saw the reluctant expression on the other party's face when he let go of the sword. But at this moment, Sally did not show any mercy. She exerted a little force and the sword broke free from his hand. Long live Evertar! Chapter 927. Sally held her sword and slowly raised it. The whispers of the soldiers around her turned into cheers. The sound quickly spread throughout the city, and all the Eiffel soldiers who heard it began to cheer. Although there were less than 2,000 soldiers and fleet members stationed in the city, the cheers from all directions still made Charles II and the nobles lower their heads in defeat. Surrendering your weapons is considered a surrender. Those who are willing to accept Eiffel's rule will temporarily go to prison to await trial. Sally was about to turn around and leave after saying this, but Charles II still said unwillingly in a low voice, "I still didn't expect that I would lose to Lucifran's daughter. Angmar was so loyal back then. When you colluded with Augustine, did you consider my father's feelings? Sally stopped in her tracks. With her back facing Charles II, she said word by word, "My father sacrificed himself to resist the undead. And you are not qualified to be mentioned in the same breath as him." Her hand holding the scepter was a little pale. 3 vipers climbed up the top of the scepter and hissed at Charles II in unison. They could clearly feel Sally's emotions, but the restrained Duke did not say anything. He just calmly walked behind Roddy and wiped away the tears at the corner of his eyes. Charles II of course knew what he had done, but any explanation at this moment would be futile. The nobles began to put their weapons on the ground. The surrounding soldiers made them form 2 lines and brought them directly to the place where they were imprisoned. All of this happened in a very short time, but it also meant that the entire war had come to an end. For the survivors in the imperial city, it did not matter who ruled them. As long as the disaster of war did not befall them, it did not matter who lived in the palace. So when the news of Charles II surrendering spread throughout the city, these people breathed a sigh of relief and even joined in the cheers. Supporting a new ruler and drawing a line was something that political opportunists had to do. Hence, the minor nobles and merchants with some status expressed their welcome and support for the Iferta army in various ways. Roddy could be considered to have witnessed a show of welcoming the king's army with his own eyes. But he had too many things to do. What he had to do next was not to celebrate the victory, but to ensure that the entire kingdom was under his control. Although the former Charles II was a monarch in name, in reality, the various feudal lords were autonomous, and their power had long been dispersed. Roddy naturally looked down on the feudal system. Hence, he had to ensure that all the feudal lords acknowledged Efta's ruling position and gradually take back the power in the feudal lords' hands. For some people, handing over power was equivalent to taking their lives. Hence, the Battle of the Ifta Infantry Division was far from over. The wooden door was pushed open, and Charles II, who had his head lowered, suddenly heard a scream. He looked up and saw that it was the Empress and her 4 children. He did not have any shackles on him, and this was not the stinky prison that he had imagined. On the contrary, the room prepared for Charles II was a remodeled hotel in the city. There were reasonable suites inside, where he could bathe and sleep, and there were specialized people to cook for him. This kind of treatment was indeed preferential for the defeated. But the current Charles II would not be deeply grateful for this. All he could feel was the decadence after all his hopes turned to dust. After the scream, the Empress threw herself into his arms and cried. Then, she began to diligently check his body for wounds. The 2 princes stood at the side with desolate expressions. Rolling and her youngest daughter stood the furthest away, and their gazes were much calmer. I failed. Charles II did not know how to explain these things to his family. His legs were abnormally sore from riding for a long time, and at this moment, he just wanted to find a place to sit. Empress Edith hurriedly helped him to the wooden bed to rest. After getting water and changing his armor, when Charles II finally caught his breath, he noticed his daughter's unusual appearance. Rolling. The latter did not speak. She just took her youngest daughter's hand and sat silently on a chair in the distance. The Empress knew why she was like this, but naturally, she could not tell Charles II at this time. What she was most concerned about was the fate of her family, so she asked in a low voice, "Did that Sally Duke say anything? Will we be pushed to the gallows?" As soon as this was said, the 2 princes' faces became even paler. The struggle for royal power never ended with mercy. When great Emperor Kun, the founder of the Kingdom of Karen, unified the kingdom, the heads of those who opposed were hung on the city wall. Charles II seemed to remember the ending he was facing at this moment, and for a moment, he was at a loss. It shouldn't be. They didn't say how to deal with the royal family. But soon, his voice became softer and softer because he didn't believe it even when he said it. Could it be used to fool his children? He suddenly got up, went to the window, opened a small crack, and looked down. There were not many guards downstairs, but they passed by in group. There were no blind spots at all. Rowling, who was next to him, looked at his actions and said, "Are you planning to escape?" Sir Charles II made a gesture and then whispered, "If we can find a chance to leave here, we can leave from a secret passage on the side of the palace. It was dug by the Aitun family 100 years ago, and then? Are you going to the port? That's where Ifta's fleet is docked." Ifta's fleet? Ifta has always been inland. When did they have a fleet? Charles II still didn't know how the imperial city fell. Therefore, Rowling's words were full of disbelief. In his mind, a fleet was not a small thing that could be created casually. Since he accepted the throne, the royal fleet of the entire kingdom of Karen had only increased by 2 battleships. How long had Ifta been independent? How could a territory located in the northwest of the kingdom have a fleet? But Rowling didn't want to answer more. She just turned her head to the side. "This building has a barrier set up by a magister. If you want to jump out, I'm afraid you will be discovered immediately." "How do you know this?" "They said it on the first day I came here." Rowling got up and drank a glass of water by herself. Then she pulled her sister to continue sitting at the edge. But Charles II was immersed in shock and didn't notice this detail. At the moment, his mind was full of the word fleet. His forehead was unknowingly sweating a lot. When he came back to his senses, he found that there were soldiers outside the door instructing servants to bring in dinner. Bread, broth, meat, and seasonal fruit. The specifications of these meals were almost the same as in the palace for Charles II. He saw Rowling calling others to eat and was a little stunned. "This isn't poisoned, right? If it was poisoned, it would have been done long ago. It wouldn't have happened today." Rowling scooped soup for her sister and said without turning her head, "If it's poisoned, can you avoid death if you don't eat?" These words rendered Charles II speechless. He used to boast in front of the nobles about his great talent and strategy, but now his brain was not as clear as his daughter's. But Rowling's choking reply also made the atmosphere of the meal more and more stiff. Charles II couldn't bring out his former monarch's aura to educate her at this moment. He just felt that his daughter seemed to have become completely estranged from him in some ways, but as for the reason, Charles II couldn't imagine it at all. After dinner, the servants cleaned the room under the watchful eyes of the soldiers. Charles II asked about the time and arrangements of the detention, but no one answered. This situation was also expected, but when he sat in a daze in the armchair at night, Charles II suddenly heard the soldiers under the window talking in a low voice. Although the other party's voice was not loud, Charles II quietly leaned his head to the window and could still roughly hear it. "Tommy, why hasn't the main force entered the city after so many days? You always tell us that Prime Minister Roddy is powerful. Why can't he fight his way through the last part of the road?" The soldier called Tommy replied lazily, "Have you forgotten the rules of the night watch? Aren't you afraid of getting beaten for talking so much nonsense? Don't scare me. The platoon leader has just led the team to the palace. Isn't he idle? If you don't want to say it, then forget it." Tommy snorted and continued, "Then let me ask you, if we only have 2,000 people to take care of this place, why do we need so many people here?" That seems to be the case. There are so many lords in the kingdom. Will it be over after we take the imperial city? What about those who don't listen? Of course, we should take advantage of the situation to take care of them now. Still fighting? Is it necessary? Do you think Prime Minister Roddy wants to be the next Charles II? Forget it. Look at the fleet, look at the special forces, look at those powerful weapons and roads. I've long heard that these things are not specially used to deal with humans, but what a nice chat, huh? Another voice came abruptly, followed by the sound of the heels of the two standing at attention. Platoon leader. If you keep talking so much nonsense, I'll transfer you to the front line tomorrow to experience it. The two soldiers only relaxed when the platoon leader's footsteps were far away. Tommy exhaled. I don't believe your words anymore. The two soldiers did not say anything unnecessary until the shift was changed, and the soldiers on duty were even more silent like mutes. Charles II stayed up until the early hours of the morning and did not hear any additional information. But even if it was only the first few sentences, he realized a fact. What Roddy wanted to do was far more than just unifying the kingdom. But what was waiting for him? The sun rose, and Charles II, who had not slept all night, continued to stare out of the window in a daze. Suddenly, the figures of giant dragons streaked past. At first, there were only 3 or 4, and then they covered the sky like migratory birds. When they hovered above the imperial city, the sky seemed to be covered by dark clouds. After that, these dragons landed in the city square in order. Although he did not know what they were doing, Charles II could clearly see that many dragons directly transformed into human forms and landed on the platform at the top of the Hersino magic tower. Chapter 928. You mean, if a noble commits a crime, he will receive the same punishment as a commoner? Sally was very curious about the judicial independence. In the eyes of her and other nobles, the judicial power always belonged to the Lord. Now that it was independent, it sounded ridiculous, but if you thought about it carefully, it was difficult to achieve absolute fairness in any judgment made by a person. If the Supreme Court was not interfered and influenced by anyone else, it could indeed make a relatively fair judgment. Giving the people a fair legal environment was also an important prerequisite for the stability of the country. Everyone present understood this principle. Roddy gave this group of people a simple political lesson, but the people present were not junior high school students. Everyone understood the future significance of this plan in a few words. With Sally's nod of support, the other members of the cabinet naturally did not have any courage to object. They also knew that the cabinet they were currently in was Roddy's word. They were here to work, and if they could solve the problem, they would stay here. If they slacked off, the consequences would be very serious. Therefore, the whole meeting went smoothly. After finalizing several plans, it was already night time. Everyone who was thirsty needed to rest, so they ended the meeting and waited for the next day to continue the discussion. After this period of time, I can relax a little. At this moment, opposite the crystal wall, Sally reclined on an armchair and drank water. Roddy was also paralyzed on the side. Through this method, even if they were thousands of miles apart, they still felt like they were meeting. Therefore, after the meeting, Sally would always pester him to talk to her. Even if it was just complaining and acting coquettishly, she would still feel very happy. There is no time to relax, we can't slack off now, Roddy said while caressing the infected beast Misha next to him. The latter did not participate in the battle, and ultimately played a role as a prop when Roddy explained the demons to the dragons. It was almost impossible to find a living pure-blooded demon in this plane, but the existence of Misha did indeed open a new door for the dragons to study demons, so Misha was now better than anyone else. Eating well, drinking well, and there were people checking every day. The only thing he had to do was to go to the various dragons' laboratories to undergo some magic tests. Life was very comfortable. Sally heard him say this and pouted. I know, studying magic is better than these politics. But, she suddenly whispered, what do you think we should do about the Crown Prince? Roddy coughed. He was now in Dragon City, and Sally was in Hollier City. The two were thousands of miles apart, and this was really a bit provocative. But Sally also knew that it was not time to be willful. She smiled. Don't fly to me in the middle of the night. Let these things first. I hope this year's harvest will be good, and don't starve to death in the winter. I will take care of this. You should rest. After saying good night to Sally, Roddy turned off the display on the crystal wall. This technology currently consumed too much crystal energy. Not to mention the nobles, even the magisters of Rasman could not afford it. If the old guys in the parliament had video communication, they would probably want everyone to finish everything in 3 seconds and then quickly turn off. If Roddy used it to chat with the emperor's wife, he would probably be scolded to death by the magisters. But it did not matter to him. After drinking the remaining water in the quilt, Roddy opened the door of the conference room, walked out of the dragon tower, and returned to his bedroom. The current kingdom of Karen did not have a mature cabinet to handle everything because the political system was in the stage of change. At the same time, many of the original old decisions were rapidly changing under the experience from Earth. It sounded like Roddy had to deal with a lot of things every day. In fact, he had gradually learned how to be a ruler. He only needed to control the direction and provide ideas, and his team of advisors made detailed plans for him. Appropriate approvals were given, and unsuitable ones were taken back and redone. In this way, apart from the fixed meetings every day, Roddy could finally squeeze out time to practice archery and study magic. At this time, he could even sit in his study and read the few letters brought back from Rasman. Back then, because the fleet that transported the loans was on official business, there was only official news. But after the war ended, the second fleet that came was mainly a trade fleet consisting of merchant ships. And this time, the fleet also brought letters from Merlin Sarah and Nafi. Looking at the 2 letters in front of him, Roddy reached out and picked up Nafi's letter. The little girl's writing was very beautiful. In the letter, there were some anecdotes that happened in class, such as someone accidentally blowing up the laboratory, someone failing to cast a spell and being beaten to a pulp by the puppet he made, and so on. Reading the letter, Roddy could not help but smile. He unconsciously read the letter several times. This letter should be for him and Camilla to read together. In the letter, Nafi also said hello to her mother and told her that she was safe. She also attached a painting. Looking at Nafi's so-called work, Roddy did not know whether to laugh or cry. In the painting, it was the image of a man with an unshaven beard, carrying a bow on his back, and wearing a dirty armor. Roddy remembered that this was the outfit he wore when he saved her and Sally near Mogra village. But Nafi had obviously just learned painting, so in the painting, Roddy did not look wise or heroic. Instead, the proportions of his body were a bit funny. The facial features on the face were also not clear. It seemed that the painting had been modified many times, and in the end it was barely a blur. But Roddy did not care about the standard of the painting. Looking at the slightly clumsy brush strokes, he could almost imagine Nafi's appearance when she was making alterations. After all, this little girl was the softest part of his heart. Even though time had passed and history had changed, Roddy decided to silently protect her in another way. It was said that a girl changes 18 times between childhood and womanhood. He did not know how much she would change the next time he saw her. When he picked up the other letter, Roddy found that Marinsara did not write much. Compared to Nafi, who could not wait to talk about her life and studies, Marinsara's writing was very calm. This was similar to how he felt when he chatted with her. She was always as calm as an ancient well, or rather, deeply hidden. After studying Lassman's magic system, there are indeed some interesting parts. But now I am trying to condense the crystals in my body. Marinsara's path of advancement was much more difficult than when she was a dragon's, but she had great perseverance, so Roddy was not worried that she would be stuck at this stage for too long. There was only one letter, and it would take at least 3 months for the message to be sent across the ocean. However, Marinsara's words added up to less than 1,000 words. When Roddy finished reading, he found that it was more like a soliloquy in the middle of the night. However, her words did not reveal much emotion. She was as calm as she was herself. After reading the words a few times, Roddy's heart seemed to be faintly anticipating something. However, no matter how hard he looked, he could not see anything. He was about to fold the letter and put it away when he suddenly saw a faint mark in the middle of the signature. He took a closer look and found that it was in the shape of the shadow dragon crystal. Roddy thought for a moment, raised his hand, and concentrated some elemental energy in his hand. Because he had absorbed the power of the shadow dragon crystal, he would always have the aura of the dragons when he cast spells. After being infected by the energy, a line of words suddenly appeared in the blank space at the bottom of the letter. "When are you coming?" This sentence made Roddy heave a sigh of relief, and then he rubbed the space between his eyebrows helplessly. How could he reconcile the conflict between the two dragons, Kardashian and Marinsura? Now that the shadow dragons had finally been cleansed of their grievances, there was only one shadow baby dragon left. Marinsura had abandoned the dragon crystal. Even if she could return to level 60 in the future, she would no longer be a shadow dragon. Roddy did not know what she would become in the future, but at least he had established a good relationship with the dragons. Speaking of which, if Marinsura wanted to take revenge, the real culprit would not be some dragons or Quio, who had suggested it, but a demon in another plane. But Roddy did not know what she wanted to do. Nephi said that she would stay there for 3 years, but he would definitely visit them midway. But he would not be able to go with the group that would set sail in September. There were too many things to do in the kingdom at the moment, so he really could not leave without permission. Besides, there were many problems that troubled him at the moment, one of which was how to pay off the debt. If he took over the kingdom, taxes would indeed be a big issue. But in this era, taxes were basically only for agriculture. There were also taxes on commerce, but during the reign of Charles II, these huge amounts of taxes did not fall into the hands of the royal family. Instead, they were divided among the feudal lords. After he put the letter away, he casually took out the current economic and population statistics of the various regions to take a look. Although he didn't know the level of the GDP of China in history, with the 3 debuffs of backward farming methods, war, and feudal lord enfeoffment, the current economic level of the Kowloon Kingdom could only be described as appalling. Most of the population was tied to the land, and more than 80% of the people could only rely on farming to support themselves. If there were natural or man-made disasters, they would easily become refugees. Under such circumstances, Roddy naturally had to adjust the proportion of taxes. Levying taxes on capital gains was the first step in his tax reform, and according to the current proportion, the tax that could be collected was much higher than the agricultural tax. Of course, the obstacles were certainly not small, but the kingdom was now under control. Instead, Roddy hoped that someone would stand up and serve as a warning to the others. Another way to pay off the debt was to sell product. Roddy had already driven the first batch of trucks produced by the Elson Munitions factory to the port, and in September, they would be transported all the way to Lashiman with the fleet. He believed that this kind of war weapon would immediately open a market in Lashiman, and then Roddy planned to include small-caliber crystal cannons in the trade list. Under the premise of maintaining the technological advantage, it was normal for a technologically advanced country to sell outdated weapons to recoup the cost. The most important thing was that these weapons were just a pile of scrap iron without the rechargeable crystal. The core technology of the rechargeable crystal was still in Roddy's hands. Before Lashiman cracked this technology, Roddy believed that he could make a huge profit in a few years, provided that there is war. He narrowed his eyes and thought for a moment, then wrote down his plan on a piece of paper. When he got up and looked out of the window, the sun was slowly sinking into the eastern mountains. Not far away, a Falcon fighter was slowly landing on the airport. Chapter 929. The members of the dragons who entered the Imperial City at this moment were mainly here to solve the demonic invasion. After confirming that many of the members were mentally invaded by the demons, Although they did not know how these lords dealt with it themselves, these members arrived at the magic tower under the supervision of their brethren today and began to receive supervision and treatment in the space-time enchantment. This was also the result of a simple discussion between Roddy and the lords. The enchantment of the magic tower could isolate the influence of the plane and prevent further invasion of the demonic consciousness. And Sally's artifact's scepter could purify from the perspective of the law. Although this kind of purification was not known to be able to cure the root cause, it was the only proven effective treatment method. There were many reasons that led to the grand scene of hundreds of dragons coming. And all the dragons at this moment had something to ask of Roddy. None of them dared to show the slightest contempt. After all, whether their compatriots could recover depended on the human prime minister in front of them. The Hersino Magic Tower had become a temporary dragon's hospital, but this was not a bad thing. The cooperation with the dragons not only required a combination of interests like the space-time rift, but also an emotional investment to cure the dragon. Moreover, such a thing did not have much technical content, and at the same time, the energy consumed was crystal subsidies, provided by the 5 dragons. In other words, this was the benefit of technical advantage. After all, if it was any other magic tower, there would not be an artifact that could achieve the space-time isolation, enchantment, and the height of the law. After every dragons enters the magic tower, they must establish a medical record to track the treatment effect of the demonic invasion. And I will try to arrange for every member of the dragons who enters the magic tower to have a checkup every other week, and the results of each checkup will be recorded in the medical record. Roddy patiently explained the arrangements to the dragons who stood together in front of him. At this time, not only the ordinary dragons needed to be isolated, but also the constantly roaring young dragons. In order to let everyone go, Edith opened a half-plane to conduct admission lectures. Roddy, on the other hand, became the attending physician of the dragons, responsible for explaining the rules and precautions in the magic tower to the dragons. As the strength of these dragons could not be compared to the 2 former lords on the 19th floor, and most of the corruption was very mild, Roddy and Edith did not intend to imprison them in a fixed cell. Instead, they made it into a sanatorium, divided into ward areas, activity areas, canteen, entertainment areas, and so on. All the dragons who were receiving treatment could not leave the magic tower. However, with Edith connecting to a few spacious half-planes, it was enough for them to spread their wings and fly freely. I have already posted the specific schedule of work and rest on the wall of the ward area. Everyone, please return to the ward area at the designated time. The medical record will record and evaluate everyone's behavior during the treatment period. These will all be shown to the feudal lords. Roddy turned his eyes to the dragons who were guarding the young dragons. The young dragons will be recuperating in the separated half-planes. I hope that the lords can arrange a few members to assist. After all, I don't understand the living habits of the young dragons. No problem, Prime Minister Roddy. Iskar, Eshin, and the others agreed politely. After explaining all the precautions, Roddy took out a stack of printed medical records for the dragons to register. Basically, he copied the regulations and procedures of modern hospitals. From then on, the dragons were orderly. With the help of Sally, Akasha, and a group of Elson mages, these dragons were quickly arranged into the original laboratories in the magic tower. When they found their beds and confirmed their positions, they found that there was a booklet at the head of each bed. The curious dragons picked it up and glanced at it. They found that it was written about the daily activities of the entertainment area, including half-plane hunting competition, mahjong tournament, football match, and other strange titles, which made the dragons a little confused. Flipping to the back, they saw the rules and playing methods of these competitions. What was strange was that there was a point reward at the back of these competitions, and points could be used to exchange for many things, including mahjong chips, betting chips, VIP treatment in the canteen, hunting area privileges, and other strange things. The dragons were confused. What did this mean? Was it encouraging them to go to the entertainment area and play these games all day? Flipping to the back, they found that the Hercino Magic Tower was not only a sanatorium, but also a magic school. Although the parish and their sanatorium were separated, if the dragons were willing to write and submit papers in their spare time, the papers that were approved could also get a number of points. The back of the booklet was a variety of precautions, basically repeating what Roddy had said before. Most of the dragons threw these things aside after reading them. They were actually not in a good mood at the moment. After all, no one could be happy to be labeled as a demon for no reason. Thinking that they might have to stay here for a long time in the future, most of them looked depressed. Some simply stared out the window in a daze. They were too lazy to even leave the house during entertainment time, and simply fell into a deep sleep. Roddy was not surprised by their reaction. At this time, he was drinking a large glass of water in the core room. He wiped his mouth and said, "I haven't talked so much in a long time. I feel a little uncomfortable. I'm afraid you'll have to work hard to keep an eye on these guys in the future. I made this decision on my own. I hope you don't blame me. If there's anything you need help with, feel free to ask." In front of him, Edith smiled, her expression inexplicably emotional. "Before I fell into a deep sleep, the dragons and the high elves still had some conflicts occasionally. But I never thought that they would agree to recuperate in this magic tower now. I really can't help but sigh at the changes that time has on us. I've heard a saying before, separated for a long time, united for a long time, separated for a long time." Roddy looked at the dragons in different postures on the crystal screen and shook his head. "It's like this now, but who knows what will happen in the future? The only thing we can do is to grasp the current situation and make the most appropriate judgment. Separated for a long time, united for a long time." Edith was still thinking about the opening line of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. On the other hand, Roddy was really tired. He said goodbye and planned to go back to rest. At this time, Kardashian was still discussing the contents of the medical records with Iskar and the others. They would probably be busy until the afternoon. As the wielder of the scepter, Sally had already begun to cast the purification spell in batches to heal the dragons. However, the power of the scepter was not unlimited. After such repeated casting for a long time, the divine weapon itself also needed to rest. Roddy finally had some free time. At this time, he planned to leave the magic tower and find a place to sleep. Although the royal city had been occupied, Roddy had only arrived this morning. He walked out of the magic tower and asked the soldiers under his command. Only then did he realize that because he had come in a hurry, he did not bring his staff, butler, and servants. No one had arranged a place for him to stay at. But this did not matter. 3 years ago, Roddy could bring Sodeler and a group of scouts to sleep on the grassland in the pouring rain. Now that he was in this royal city, he could find a place to sleep. However, after taking a look at the majestic palace that was mainly white, he suddenly became interested and walked over. In his memory, he had been to this royal city before. But according to the historical timetable, the first time he came here was in 593. At that time, he came here specifically to complete a task. At that time, the royal city was still the most prosperous city in the kingdom of Karen. The situation of the invasion of the orcs in the northwest was rotten, but the royal city was still filled with a luxurious atmosphere. Because of Roddy's low level, he did not have many gold coins, so he could only afford to live in the hotels in the slums. At that time, the brothels and casinos along the street were noisy all night. No matter what time it was, the smell of bad perfume and sour sweat could be smelled. And now, he was stepping on the white stairs, directly into the royal palace. Because when the army arrived, the servants scrambled to escape, and the ground was full of all kinds of garbage and debris that they did not have time to take away. The army was only responsible for fighting, not for cleaning, so the originally neat royal palace could be said to be a mess at this moment. Stepping into the long corridor, Hao Run saw the statues of Emperor Kong and his father, Count Buchanan, on both sides. Both of them were riding on war horses and were dressed in military uniforms. The lances in their hands were held horizontally in front of them. All the founding ancestors were usually people with outstanding martial arts, and the kingdom of Karen was no exception. However, Emperor Kong, who was able to unify the kingdom, did not control all the forces in his territory, even when he was at the peak of his power. This had nothing to do with his ability, but it had something to do with his way of thinking. Because the human beings in this plane had developed to the present state, they had always been used to the feudal system of lords. Therefore, they did not have a clear understanding of the complete centralization of power. In history, some people tried to centralize power, but what they did was to control the lords under their rule through various means. A unified regime that could command the world had not yet appeared here. Roddy did not have a deep understanding of politics. Like most people of his age, he had already returned the knowledge he learned in school to the teacher. He also did not have a detailed understanding of the current political structure of the major countries on Earth. He only knew that the United States had a separation of powers, and the United Kingdom had a constitutional monarchy, and so on. As for the specific process of formation and experience, he did not know. At this moment, Roddy did not think too much about it. He walked along the corridor and entered the council hall. Now the hall was empty, and only a small number of EFTA guards were guarding the door. Roddy could see that the sand table that had not been removed was still placed in the council hall. When he got closer, he saw that there was a route on it for how to transport the soldiers to Enrique City. The white marble throne was in the center of the council hall. Roddy remembered that he had only seen it in pictures before, because at that time, he was not qualified to come here to observe. Chapter 9:30. When he realized this, Roddy did not have any fanatical joy or desire. The height of his vision made him look down on the so-called king position. In fact, he had no choice but to become the prime minister. If he could, of course, he hoped that the country would be prosperous and the people would be at peace. It would be better for him to travel the world with his beautiful wife. Looking up at the sunlight shining through the domed window into the room, Roddy walked to the throne, but he sat down on the marble steps in front of him, a little tired. He looked at the empty hall and imagined the scene of Charles II discussing matters here with the ministers. From now on, this scene would no longer exist, and the once all-powerful Viper Cross would also disappear in the dust of history in the future. After the enemy disappeared, what should he do next? Invasion of the demons was a proposition that still sounded far away. At present, the demons could only affect through mental attacks, and there should be some time before the full-scale war. Although the blueprint described by the dragons was very beautiful, only he knew that the EFTA army was now almost at its limit. From Elson, Hollier City to the Royal City, including the roads that extended out horizontally, the entire front line had been stretched to nearly 2,000 kilometers. The road construction puppets working day and night had changed hundreds of sets of easily worn parts, not to mention the trucks. Even if Elson City had not stopped production, the carrying capacity was still in a state of shortage. The smooth end of the entire war also meant that Roddy had the ability to repay the sky-high war loan. The consumption of gold coins and crystal reserves could really be called burning money, but as long as EFTA was the only legal regime in the future, the deficit of these resources could be filled one by one. Roddy was in a daze for a while before he remembered to check his mission list. From the beginning of the war, the mission bar generated an epic-level mission, War of Conquest. After the encounter with Lord Morlars, Another epic-level mission, Pacify the Dragon's Strife, was generated. 3 years ago, Roddy had to rely on luck to accept epic-level missions, but now it could be generated directly by the system. When a person became powerful, it would indeed produce this snowballing advantage. As the Prime Minister, Roddy was naturally different from the scout captain who only controlled a small team. He clicked on the completed mission icon and checked the mission reward. As these 2 epic quests were generated from Roddy's own actions, they did not reward him with any equipment. Instead, they rewarded him with a huge amount of EXP and reputation. A total of 60 million EXP was enough for Roddy to upgrade his second class to level 29 or his first class to level 55. With this calculation, Roddy found that the gap between him and the dragons was indeed gradually narrowing. If there was another similar war, it was certain that he would return to the threshold of a level 59 Shadow Hunter. However, he was not in a hurry to distribute them. Instead, he carefully looked at the remaining title rewards. After the War of Conquest was completed, Roddy had become the true ruler of the Kingdom of Karen. Therefore, he was rewarded with the title of Conqueror, which had a powerful effect. When in the territory of the Kingdom of Karen, all attributes would be increased by 30%. This alone was enough for him to dominate all the archers in the Kingdom of Karen. Pacify the Dragon's Strife did not give him a title, but a huge amount of reputation from all the dragons and 5 advanced talent points. To Roddy's regret, these 2 quests did not give him any new skills. They were all basic rewards, but the amount was ridiculously large to make up for the gap. A lot of derivative quests had also popped up in the quest pane. Because there were still some lords in the territory of the Kingdom of Karen who had not declared their loyalty to the Ifta regime, Roddy still had a Sweep the Nation quest. At the same time, if the territory was expanded, he could also complete the Expand the Territory quest. As for the system building, it was not shown in the quest pane. After all, this was just a plan that Roddy had put in the plan, and it had not yet reached the implementation stage. He looked at the attribute pane, but there was no longer the joy and expectation of being able to level up. With his current status and identity, it was difficult for him to participate in a battle in person. The emergence of firearms had changed the custom of the general personally leading the soldiers in a charge. Not to mention Roddy, even Sodeler, who should have been the sword saint, had now become a general who squatted in a bunker and commanded the troops. The influence of personal strength seemed to be declining rapidly under the halo of firearms. This situation reminded Roddy of the scene on Earth when China was invaded by the British and French during the end of the Qing dynasty. Spears, broadswords, and cavalry were really helpless in the face of artillery and firearms. Closing the page, Roddy got up, patted his clothes, and continued to walk into the palace. He did not want to show his ownership, but was simply curious about the residence of the monarch. However, after a few rounds, he found that without the luxurious decorations, the messy palace was really not worth looking at. He left the bedroom with some disappointment and looked up at the corner towers around the White Palace area. This design was naturally for defense purposes. However, the Imperial Palace was located at the highest point of the entire Imperial City. So, Roddy walked over and jumped onto the corner tower. He stood at the edge of the Imperial Palace with the best view and looked down. It was already afternoon, and the sun had not set yet. The golden light sprinkled on the densely packed buildings. Looking carefully, with Roddy's powerful eyesight, he could even see the people in the house cooking. In this era, most people only had 2 meals a day. And because it was close to the sea, most people ate fish and seafood. There were dried salted fish hanging outside the windows, and people's clothes were not very fancy. They all had some frowns on their faces. Roddy felt that it was not the sorrow of the so-called royal family's fall, but the nervousness about the future. No matter how Charles II governed the country, as long as the common people had something to eat, they would not clamor for rebellion all day long. Roddy turned his gaze to the southern coastline. The fishing boats that were returning to the sea were hesitating whether to dock or not. They clearly could not understand why the wolf head flag was hung at the port. Further away, dark clouds gathered above the sea level, and a storm was brewing. Roddy's thoughts cooled and became clear because of this perspective. Previously, he had considered how to optimize the army in the future, how to deal with the invasion of the demons, and so on. But now it seemed that his ideas were a little unrealistic, because the first thing he had to do was to restore the vitality of the people who had suffered the most during the years of war. This was the foundation of a leader's governance. On the third day after Charles II surrendered, the road was finally built outside the imperial city with the help of the engineering company. According to the speed of road construction during the war, the road could actually be built the next day. But because the war was over, the road standard was once again based on durability as the highest benchmark. The smooth road allowed countless trucks to drive into the imperial city, and the additional troops were to maintain the stability of the city during the upcoming meeting. But according to convention, the barracks were still built outside the city. For Rorschach and the others, they were already familiar with such things. After spending half a day to finish, Rorschach was about to call the soldiers to rest when the company commander arranged a new task, to assist the dragons in preparing the venue for the upcoming meeting. This mission made all the soldiers look at each other in dismay. Then, they were all abnormally excited because this mission was related to the dragon race. When they were old, they could still tell their children, back then, when the dragon race held a meeting, the venue was built by us personally. Stop talking nonsense, stand at attention, run, go. As soon as Rorschach gave the command, the soldiers immediately stopped their discussion, and then began to jog into the city in unison. At this time, because of the increase in patrols in the city, martial law was no longer enforced during the day. The citizens were curiously watching these soldiers from Ifta. They were originally afraid because in their impression, most of the soldiers were barbaric and unruly, and it was normal for them to draw their swords and kill people at the slightest disagreement. But now these people all looked like unsmiling puppets, especially those who stood guard. They stood there for a few hours without moving, and those who patrolled never talked to each other. It was really strange. Now, when the construction company jogged across the street to the square, the people gradually lost their original vigilance. They began to point curiously and whisper among themselves. When Count Lumans entered the city, his private soldiers did evil everywhere and raped the daughter of the old Hannibal family. In the end, they didn't receive any punishment. A few days ago, a few counts brought their troops into the city. I didn't even dare to open the windows. I heard that one of the doors wasn't closed properly, and they rushed in and robbed a lot of things. It seems that these soldiers of Ifta are really not bad. Exactly. I heard that yesterday, a group of people from the Mole Gang tried to steal things during the chaos. After they were discovered by the patrols, more than 10 of them were executed on the spot. Oh, awesome. I was blackmailed by them before. These damn bastards. Awesome. As Rorschach ran, he could not hear all the discussions around him, but they were indeed praising the soldiers of Ifta. This situation surprised him. After all, before everyone entered the city, the company commander had specifically given a death order to strictly abide by the military discipline and strictly prohibit any form of conflict with the citizens. He thought that when he entered the city, he would be insulted or thrown stones by the citizens, but now it seemed that there was no conflict. Chapter 931. Without the control of the Lord, sooner or later there will be rebellions everywhere. In the tavern, the middle-aged man named Panda said to the people around him, "There were many illiterates these days, and too few people had the ability to think independently. Therefore, most people were in a state of believe whatever you say. Panda's words were baseless, but they still received applause from the people around him. This kind of reactionary speech was said many times, and people thought that Sally I would be overthrown tomorrow. However, when the door was pushed open, the rule of Sally I was not shaken, but became more and more stable. Look, without the moon god to save us, everything will fall into chaos. Panda raised his glass and drank the rest of the ale, whispering something. Someone next to him asked curiously, Moon god? What god is that? Is it another name for Goddess Sichi? Goddess Sichi? That's just a false god. Only the moon god is the only god, she shines on the earth and is the only ancient god in the world. The moon god that Panda mentioned made everyone interested, but he seemed to be unwilling to have so many people ask about it. He shook his head. When you see the moon god, you will know her greatness. Anything you say now is meaningless. See? The moon god can still see? The people around were surprised. Panda said with certainty, Tonight is a full moon, as long as you stare at the moon, you will know the answer. After saying that, he paid for the wine and left the tavern, leaving a crowd of skeptical people. After leaving the tavern, Panda strolled drunkenly on the street, but after turning a corner, his face quickly returned to calmness. The original blush and drunkenness seemed to have never appeared. Passing through the alley, he took off his dirty and sloppy coat, tied up his messy hair, and walked out of the street again. He was like a different person from the previous Panda, and no one would recognize him as the drunkard who promoted the moon god. Arriving at the predetermined location, he mounted his horse and left the town of Pucali. After making sure that no one was following him, he traveled for nearly 2 hours and entered a nearby forest. Following the inconspicuous markings in the forest, he finally arrived in front of a low magic tower. This magic tower was fixed, and could not be moved like Hersino Magic Tower. However, its defensive measures were one of the strongest, because when Panda approached the magic tower, he could see more than 100 corpses of all kinds on the ground beside it. Among them were various kinds of magic beasts, passing beasts, mercenaries and caravans, but their bodies had become bones, as if they had been dead for many years. Panda turned a blind eye. After several detours according to the established route, he finally entered the magic tower. As soon as he entered, he saw a robed servant greeting him, Arcane Master Pan of Lord. At the top. He nodded and walked into the tower. At this time, the people in Panda's sight were all wearing robes that were different from human mages. If Edith was here, she would definitely recognize that the style of their robes was inherited from the High Elf. And these people were all members of the Holy Assembly. Compared with the past, the structure of the Holy Assembly had undergone a drastic change. A year ago, there were 6 elders in the Holy Assembly, each leading the arcanists and arcane warriors under their command. These people, who called themselves descendants of the High Elves, lived in secret in the kingdom of Karen. However, due to a series of changes, Elder Dominic, who tried to take over Elson City, died, and Crawford, Kyle, and Aubrey, who wanted to take over Hersino Magic Tower, all disappeared. When Hersino Magic Tower reappeared in the capital and witnessed the unification of the kingdom of Karen, the only remaining elders, Elder Blake and Elder Musta, knew that most of the main forces of the Holy Assembly had been completely destroyed in this operation. As the only 2 remaining elders, their only choice was to gather the resources and personnel left behind by the other elders to ensure that the descendants of the High Elves did not suffer any more losses. During this time, Iferta and the Karen royal family officially declared war, and the kingdom fell into civil war. Thus, the Holy Assembly had enough time to breathe. The 2 elders also quickly carried out the rescue plan. However, just 2 months ago, when the war ended, the Holy Assembly also completed a preliminary reorganization. The change happened at this time, when Elder Blake met with Elder Musta. he suddenly announced that Musta was a traitor of the Holy Assembly, and took out a piece of evidence of Musta's correspondence with Elson, using this reason to imprison Musta. The latter died in prison a week later, and the entire Holy Assembly was changed from the co-governance of the elders to the one-man rule of Elder Blake. Panda walked all the way to the top of the magic tower. Along the way, he saw many members who originally belonged to the other elders, but now they were no longer labeled as certain elders, but united as disciples of Lord Blake. May the moon god bless all things. Coming to the last door, Panda pretended to make a gesture of worship, and the guard in front of the door opened the door for him. After entering, the conspicuous white high-back chair in the middle was very conspicuous. Arcanists had never believed in God, and as an intermediate arcanist, Panda himself would not become a believer. However, Lord Saint, the original Elder Blake, believed that the only way to preserve the Holy Assembly was to imitate those religions in history, to use miracles and doctrines to win over enough people, and to select qualified elites from the huge number of believers to provide fresh blood for the backbone of the Holy Assembly. Bloodline theory was the symbol of the Holy Assembly in the past. However, after more than 70% of the members had been lost, if the bloodline theory was maintained, it would certainly be a long time before the Holy Assembly could recover its former glory. Therefore, there was a funny scene. Arcanists who did not believe in God called the name God of Moon, but in fact they used this set of theory to fool ignorant human beings. Panda, you're back. The so-called Saint Blake was a gray-haired, middle-aged arcanist. As the last remaining elder of the Holy Assembly, he seemed to be in good spirits, but his eye sockets were deep and he was a little bald. The white robe he wore was different from the usual arcanist robes. There were several moons on it, obviously the attire of the Pope. Panda bowed and the latter helped him up. The news spread during this time should be enough. Did you find anything new? Lord Saint, to be honest, most people are as stupid as pigs and dogs. Although they can easily join the Holy Assembly, how can such people be qualified to continue this noble legacy? Panda actually looked down on these ordinary people. In the eyes of arcanists, the general public was really stupid. It had only been a few months since Blake founded the Moon God clan outside, and it already had more than 3,000 believers. However, 99% of them were illiterate, so how could they learn arcana? When there is enough, quantity will lead to quality change. We need patience, Blake said mysteriously, then changed the topic. I heard that a high elf ruin was found somewhere? It's in the Silent Forest, Lord Saint. But I suspect it's a trap. Panda immediately gave his judgment. The Silent Forest is so close to Hollier, and the Wood Elves have long opened up trade with humans. I don't believe that there isn't Efta's influence behind it. The other elders have sent people to search Wagra City before, but no one has ever returned alive. There's something fishy about this sudden news. You're right. I don't think there's much truth in this news either, unless there's concrete evidence that someone came out alive. Otherwise, I won't believe it. Blake didn't put on much airs when he spoke to Panda because Panda was his most capable and most trusted subordinate. However, he didn't give up on this idea immediately. Instead, he continued, but if there's a 1 in 10,000 chance, we should still go investigate. Lord Saint? Chapter 932. Strange emphasized the difference. I heard that Prime Minister Roddy went to Lockman, but I didn't expect him to do so many things without a sound. He even has a fleet. How much money would that cost? Charles II doesn't seem to have a decent fleet? Crone did not know much about ship. He only vaguely knew that a large warship required a lot of time and energy to build, and a huge amount of money to maintain after launching. Because there was not much desire for marine resources, and because shipbuilding technology was not brilliant, the Kingdom of Karen's annual naval construction was only at the stage of maintaining the old capital. There are only 7 or 8 decent warships in the port here. I heard that on the day the Ifurta fleet came, a round of concentrated fire directly smashed one of them. Strange had gathered all this information from the Four Corners. She was the most sensitive to current affairs among all the magisters, and she was the first to know that Elson was going to hold a magic exchange. Now listening to her, Crone also faintly felt the amazing power behind Roddy. After all, back in Elson, they were only amazed by the other party's authority in magic. And now it seemed that Roddy had crushed Charles II in all aspects. That's a good thing. With a fleet, it means that his future is far more than the current country. Crone sighed. He has higher standards than Emperor Kun, as if he didn't put the royal family in his eyes from the beginning. Now that I think about it, it's only been less than a month since the war started. Strange nodded. So we have to be prepared. What preparation? Preparations to go to Lochman, Strange said, her eyes shining like a little girl. The route between Elson and Lochman is definitely open. Now that the kingdom is unified, we will definitely send mages over for exchange in the future. There were only a few apprentices selected at the beginning. I don't know if it will be a magister's turn this time. When it came to the issue of magic, Crone also became spirited. It's such a long way. There are no particularly large ships here. I guess the quota will be very limited? So should we discuss it with the Prime Minister in advance? If we can go to Lochman, I'd be happy to take out all my magic crystal. Strange's voice was very low. She only had her back to Scarlet, obviously because they couldn't get along. Just as Crone was about to answer, he heard a rustling sound next to him. Turning their heads, the two realized that there were people at the entrance of the public laboratory, and all the mages stood up. Because the person who entered the door was none other than the Prime Minister they were just talking about, Roddy. Everyone, sit down. There's no need to stand up. I just want to say a few things. Roddy was dressed very casually. He wore a hunting jacket and a sword. This outfit was much simpler than the complicated clothes of the royal family. There were more than 20 mages in the room, and 3 of them were magisters. Roddy's gaze was naturally focused on Crone, Strange, and Scarlet. He looked around the large public laboratory. This place was originally designed for low-level mages to experiment and communicate. When Quayo created this magic tower, he mainly referred to the style of the High Elves, so the style here was very similar to Helsino's. Of course, Roddy wasn't here to lament. He stood in front of the crowd and said, "The contents of the discussion with the dragons are almost done. The alliance ceremony will be held in a week. I hope that everyone will be on time. It would be best if you can come. If anyone doesn't want to participate, you can bring it up with me now." Naturally, no one objected to this, so Roddy directly put a notice on the table next to him. The specific seats are all here. If you're afraid of getting it wrong, you can go to the venue below to look for it in advance. After the mages quieted down again, Roddy continued, "There's another thing. The port reconstruction will probably be completed in September. At that time, there will be a route to Lochman. This time, it's not strictly an exchange, so all mages above apprentice level are eligible to sign up. There's no upper limit to the number of people. As I said, if anyone doesn't want to go, just let me know." This news immediately caused an uproar in the crowd. Even Scarlet, who had always been cold, had her eyes lit up. Crone and Strange, who were just thinking about how to fight for the opportunity, were also a little stunned. After a few seconds, Strange asked in a low voice, "Then, can we bring the apprentices in our magic tower?" "Yes, bring as many as you can. Let me remind you, it's better to get used to the long voyage in advance, lest you vomit on the way." Then Roddy pointed at his feet. "After tomorrow, the Dragon's Tower will become the Dragon's office in the Kingdom of Karen. Each of the 5 major dragons will send at least one member of the dragons to be stationed here, and this will also become the future administrative center of the Kingdom of Karen. All mages will still work in Elsen in the future, but you still have a month to prepare. In the middle of July, bring your items and apprentices here to gather. This was said without rhyme or reason, because to go to Elsen, they needed to go north. Why would they come to the Imperial City? However, the vibration from under their feet seemed to answer this question. Hearing a low roar coming from outside the window, Roddy saw many people turning their heads to observe, so he pointed and said, "There's no harm in looking, because the future airport to this place is under construction. The road from here to Elsen will take about 4 to 5 hours by plane." With permission, Crone and the others quickly rushed to the window, because this laboratory was at the top of the Dragon Tower, almost 80 meters above the ground. Including the terrain of the central square, it was much higher than the position of the city wall. Looking north from here, they could see the land in the north of the city that was changing violently. The scene of the black dragon spreading its wings to cast a spell was too conspicuous. The originally dense forest and giant trees quickly withered, broke, and turned into countless debris under a green light. The color of the soaked ground was originally dark, but with the recitation of the spell by the black dragon Hurlo, a faint light flashed in the soil, and the mages could see that this was a precursor to the solidification spell. The next moment, an invisible force suddenly pressed down, and the ground covering an area of more than 4 square kilometers was compressed and flattened with a bang. After that, the solidification spell completely permeated the ground over and over again, and the entire prototype of the entire airport was completed in these few minutes. This scene made the mages in the Dragon Tower feel the same as Rorschach and the others in the past, unable to calm down for a long time. But what they were thinking about was another point, since when were dragons willing to help humans do these things? What else would they do in the future? Would these dragons also fly over and burn to ashes whoever Roddy disliked? Thinking of this, the mages were even more in awe. They did not know that this was the effect that Roddy wanted. The construction of the airport was actually just a suggestion by Kardashian. The other dragons happened to be idle, and now that they wanted to build a good relationship with Roddy, they all agreed to go over and show their skills. And at this moment, Roddy let the mages, coincidentally, watch the process. In the future, the deterrence of this group of people would affect all their decisions for a long time. Previously, Roddy had thrown out so many benefits. Naturally, he would not simply be a lay foe. The principle of carrot and stick. He could now easily use it. "That's all, I'll leave first. Continue with your work." He exchanged a few pleasantries with the mages, then quickly left. And as soon as he left, there was a heated discussion in the public laboratory, ********* a week later. Charles II had stayed in the closed hotel for 5 days. Compared to his haggard appearance at the beginning, the current him had regained his original complexion. There was enough food every day, and there was hot water for a bath. Other than not being able to go out, the family did not suffer any abuse. However, such days were still a kind of torture for the former royal family. They felt that there was a sharp sword hanging over their heads, and they did not know when it would fall. And this morning, Charles II was awakened by a knock on the door. He got up from the bed in simple linen pajamas. The Queen beside him pursed her lips and held his hand, but Charles II signaled her not to be nervous, and went to open the door himself. Outside the door was no longer a soldier, but a white-haired old man who looked like a butler. Charles II suddenly felt that he looked familiar, and the latter had already bowed and said, "I am Count Fraser's butler, Mora. I've seen you before, at the autumn hunting ground." Charles II accurately said this, but the other person did not show a grateful look. He just nodded and said, "Your memory is not bad." This kind of reaction made the former emperor very uncomfortable. He was stunned and continued to ask, "What's the matter?" "Prime Minister Roddy needs you to cooperate with the Kingdom of Karen and the Dragon's Alliance ceremony that will be held today. Here is what you need to do. It's all written on the paper." The butler took out 6 pieces of paper and distributed them to everyone in front of him. The Queen, who had never been involved in political affairs, was a little hesitant. We also need to read it? Not only do you need to read it, but you also need to sign after reading it to show that you accept the content. Mora beckoned the servants behind him and placed quills and ink on the table for them. Charles II knew that this might be related to his fate, so he quickly picked it up and read it. After a quick glance, his eyes widened in surprise. "We won't die." The 2 princes immediately breathed a sigh of relief, while Princess Rolling read the content of the paper to her illiterate sister in a low voice. After the latter nodded in confusion, Rolling held her little hand and signed their names one by one. Chapter 933. Mora calmly answered Charles II's question. The latter seemed to be unwilling. "What if I don't sign it?" There was no answer to such a question. Mora looked at him in silence. His eyes were full of pity. He really felt that the Emperor had lost his mind. Could he continue to be the Emperor if he didn't sign it? Charles II knew that he had asked a stupid question. He coughed twice and signed his name happily. Mora put away a few pieces of paper. After that, the servants came into the room with sets of clothes. There are still 2 hours. Enough time to change into formal clothes. As Mora's voice trailed off, Charles II looked at the various clothes in the hands of the servants and asked curiously, "Are they going too?" The Prime Minister naturally hopes that everyone can attend in a dignified manner. He respects the royal family, not just you. Charles II did not feel much about these words, but the Queen and children behind him had different expressions. After all, in the tradition of the Kowloon Kingdom, the status of princes, princesses, and queens was not even worth mentioning in front of the monarch, and this was especially true for women. Rolling and her younger sister were both tools to win over power. In the Tanro dynasty 200 years ago, Queen Anna, who was known as the Black Queen, relied on the dozen or so children she gave birth to gain control over a vast territory. As long as one lived long enough and had enough children, then the method of political marriage would be tested time and time again. Although the kingdom of Karen was a change of dynasty, this concept had always been followed, so there was no figure of women in major occasions. Therefore, the Queen and Rolling were surprised by this arrangement. Butler Mora. After Charles II was silent, Rolling suddenly said, "The agreement says that we can all be ordinary people in the future. Is it true?" Since it is written in black and white, the Prime Minister naturally has to guarantee this. Mora did not hide it from them. Of course, ordinary people have to do what ordinary people should do. If you continue to have unrealistic fantasies, I don't need to say more about the result. It is written in the agreement. Rolling was relieved after hearing this and nodded heavily. "I understand. It's good that you understand." Mora did not answer more questions. He turned and left, leaving behind these once the most distinguished family in the entire kingdom. When the sun rose, Pugadoo packed up his reporter ID, picked up his heavy backpack, and walked out of the tavern in the imperial city. Cheer up! Today was a historic day. We are the people who record history. Whoever dares to slack off in the slightest, this daddy will definitely peel off his skin. When they arrived at the restaurant on the first floor, Boris, the foreign news director of Cullen's time, was making the final arrangements. In fact, they were already familiar with such arrangements, so he mainly emphasized the importance of this ceremony. Everyone's ears had become calloused from listening to him. At this moment, they were all lowering their heads to eat. Picado came 2 minutes late and was scolded by the supervisor. He gloomily grabbed some bread and dried meat and hid in a corner to eat. Imperial City? The food in this broken place is truly unpalatable. Malika, a colleague next to him, complained in a low voice. Because the city had previously plundered food for the front line, The food resources in these taverns were also very scarce. At this moment, only air-dried meat, salted fish, and brick-like bread could be taken out. If the supervisor had not asked the people in the tavern to boil hot water in a large pot, they would probably have to eat cold water for breakfast. Malika, haven't you always yearned for the life of a socialite in the Imperial City? How do you feel now? Pocahontas teased the beautiful female colleague, who rolled her eyes and said, "If you can, please tell me the train back to Elson. I want to go back now." Compared to the clean and tidy life in Elson, the places in the Imperial City, except for the palace, actually broke the inner imagination of many people. Although it was spacious, there were many shops, a large city area, and a large population. It felt like a garbage dump. There was no such thing as a toilet in the Imperial City, so feces and all kinds of garbage were just thrown on the street. Only during major festivals or events would the king order to clean it. Therefore, the impression this place gave to the Elson reporters was so bad that they even had to look down when they walked, for fear of stepping on something that would spoil their appetite. If it were not for the fact that the city defense team had replaced the EFTA infantry division in the past few days, the chaotic public security would have made them even more afraid to go out. But walking out at this time, they absolutely did not have to worry about safety. After eating, Pocahontas followed a group of people out of the tavern, and then all the way south to the venue of the ceremony. At this moment, the central square had been cordoned off by the army. Soldiers in armor stood straight at each intersection. Pocahontas went through 2 security checks from beginning to end before he went in. Not long after he came in, there was a long line outside. The invited participants had begun to enter one after another. These people who entered the venue were of all kinds, and they all held the same ticket in their hands. Pocahontas heard that these people were people's representatives who had been selected after screening. But it seemed that the invitees themselves did not have such awareness. The expressions on their faces were mostly confused, and they exchanged views on the previous war with each other. After taking a closer look, Pocahontas found that these people were actually from all levels of the kingdom. There were many farmers dressed in plain clothes, and those who were dressed in slightly more decent clothes should be the owners of the shops in the city. Some of the shop owners outside the royal city were also invited. After all, some of them wore clothes with the logo of the shop to identify their identity. Pocahontas usually came in contact with such information all day long. At a glance, he knew that all the famous shops in the country should have people in charge. After that, there were mage apprentices, mages, and people from various related industries in robes. He also saw a witch in strange clothes with a crow on her shoulder, walking in front of the crowd with a cold face. Behind them, there were mages with gorgeous staffs, leading 2 teams of apprentices into the venue from a dedicated passage. Thousands of people of all kinds came in from the 8 entrances. The tickets in their hands were different colors, corresponding to the 8 colored areas of the central square. The symbols on the tickets corresponded to the seat. Even if the farmers were illiterate and could not understand, there were people standing there to guide them to their seat. There was a faint fragrance of flowers in the venue. Pocahontas also did not understand how this venue could be filled with flowers on both sides of the aisle. He only knew that he had a lot of things to do. At this time, apart from setting up the equipment with his colleagues, he also had to work hard to memorize the few question scripts that he brought with him. The venue facing the north of the Dragon Tower was ready. Pocahontas glanced at the stands in the opposite direction. The identities of the participants there were shocking. Apart from those noble lords who expressed their allegiance to Ifta's rule, more than half of the members in the first 3 rows were giant dragons with dragon horns on their heads. Although they were in human form and tried to restrain their aura, with dozens of giant dragons sitting there, even an inexperienced farmer would feel uncomfortable as if his skin was being pricked by needles. In the direction of the back, there was a group of powerful mages in robes. At the same time, There was Commander Sodeler in military uniform and a group of members of IFTA's military. Magister Houdini was chatting happily with Crone and the others. Sylvia, Doris, Evelyn, and other members of the Elson Magic Research Department, who were involved in the research of airplanes, trucks, and cannons were also present. At the same time, there was the company commander and platoon leader of the engineering company in military uniform. Behind them was the fleet commander in a white sailor suit and others. Picado did not even take a second look before he heard a buzzing sound coming from above the dragon tower. Then, in the middle of each side of the octagonal dragon tower, the image of the current northern podium appeared. Roddy, who was wearing a grayish-black suit, had already stepped onto the podium. This live broadcast method of showing the image of the conference to all the participants at the same time gave everyone an unprecedented feeling of novelty. At first, they could not help but let out a cry of surprise. However, as Roddy comforted and explained, the venue quickly became quiet and quickly fell into Roddy's rhythm. Picado hurriedly aimed the camera rack at the podium with his colleagues and began to continuously print images on the huge white paper through the magic circle. Look at the engraving of the crystal stone. When it's about to reach the limit, change it in advance. We can't make any mistakes at this time. Yes. He barely heard what Prime Minister Roddy said on the podium. He only vaguely heard words like transfer of power and voluntary abdication. But just as he was pondering what abdication meant, the crowd on the podium stunned him, because it was Charles II, his queen, and his family. The crowd exclaimed again. The popularization of the newspapers allowed them to recognize these people. Even if they did not recognize them, Charles II monarch attire, sword, and crown clearly showed his identity. Hurry up and film. What are you waiting for? Amid the urging, Picado quickly aimed at the podium and began to film. He was thinking the same thing as most of the civilians. Are they going to be hacked to death on the spot later? But then, Sally and Duke appeared on the podium in their splendid attire. At the same time, there were 5 dragons dressed in different colors on the podium. With Roddy's introduction, the crowd then learned that they were the top 5 dragons in this world. The 3 cameras below were frantically filming this historic moment. The people present almost held their breath because the aura of the dragons was too strong. They could feel the dense elemental rhythm from such a distance. The 5 dragons were very polite to Prime Minister Roddy and Sally and Duke. When the people recovered from the shock, they realized that the 5 dragons were witnesses to the transfer of power. Charles II and the Queen made a speech on the podium, meaning that they were not capable enough to lead the people of the Kingdom of Karen to happiness and health. So they bowed to apologize, took off the crown and sword, and handed them to Sally and Duke with both hands. Sally took the sword, and at the same time, Lord Victor put on a brand new gorgeous crown made of hundreds of gemstones to announce the birth of the new king. Chapter 934. Natha rarely spoke so much, but she needed to play the role that the intelligence agency needed. Thus, she had prepared a script for what she was going to say. Brody looked at her and laughed. 2 years really weren't wasted. You've long surpassed an old man like me. That's great, that's great. His words made Natha blush. Being shy, she quickly changed the topic. Village Chief Body didn't beat you up in the end, did he? Not to that extent. No matter how fierce the quarrel was, it was just a quarrel. I persuaded him to open the trade route and let everyone have a good life. Even if he sold the metal armor in his village, they wouldn't have to starve. But he didn't listen, so I left after putting down the food. I hope they can survive the winter. Brody also wanted to find someone to pour out his frustrations, so he rambled on and on about many details. Natha found it strange and asked, Chief Body has metal armor? Body's village was about 60 to 70 kilometers away from Elsa's village, but it would normally take 4 to 5 days to reach in the forest. Although Natha had never been there, She remembered that the wood elf villages in the Forest of Silent Whispers had similar economic standards. Metal weapons were already considered family heirlooms. Where had she heard of metal armor? I don't know when he made it. Before he left, he was holding a magic crystal in his hand, as if he was afraid that I didn't know how valuable it was, Brody said disdainfully. But if you don't sell it, it's just a rock. Tisk, it's funny anyway. When the old village chief shook his head, Natha frowned. She continued chatting for a while, and then got up to leave. Brody saw her out. After leaving the wooden house, Natha went to the market and bought a few specialty products of the wood elves that she didn't like, a basket woven from dried vines and a bottle of freshly brewed fruit wine. This made it seem as if she planned to leave after a while. Along the way, she ran into Randolph again. The latter must have been fighting the whole night. His eyes were unusually swollen, but he forced himself to come over and talk to Natha when he saw her. She raised the things in her hands and said that she had something to do before returning to the tavern. When she entered, she saw Nora practicing her stab with her tail. She put down the things and said with a serious expression, "Something might be wrong. October 25th. I didn't expect the information I collected here to be so incomplete." In the cabinet office of the Dragon Tower, Kardashian sat on a large wooden table and ate a red fruit. She complained, "The dragons record history from a different perspective than the High Elves. I had forgotten about this before. But now that I look at it carefully, many of the details are completely vague. Some are even just guesses. I really don't know who wrote these records." She had returned to the dragon domain to look for information on the destruction of the High Elves. However, she found that there weren't many samples that could be used for analysis. Roddy didn't expect the dragons to be lazy either. He read through some documents from 700 years ago and found that the dragons' records of the High Elves were very general. What happened on a certain date, what happened, and what happened. From beginning to end, it was summarized in one sentence. It sounded like the records of the Grand Historian, but it wasn't as detailed. This was because the dragons who wrote these records seemed to be just doing their job. They would write a few sentences when they were interested and throw them aside when they weren't. Roddy looked again and felt that it was worse than a primary school student's composition. In the end, it seems that the dragons also think that the destruction of the High Elves is strange? Yes. Actually, all the lords have discussed this before, but they all have their own opinions. Most of them think that the demons are the cause. Some also say that the High Elves' arcane magic is dangerous. Oh, this was said by the previous Lord of the Red Dragons because Edith once taught his subordinates a lesson. Kardashian pursed her lips. He must have said that because he couldn't win. But the information you brought mentioned something. Roddy wrote a word on a blank piece of paper. Out of control. The High Elves' internal strife was caused by the loss of control of certain groups. This seems to be a very important cause. But what kind of loss of control was not clearly written? The High Elves' consciousness? Could it be that the demons invaded their minds? Very likely. Kardashian followed his train of thought and analyzed. Perhaps some High Elves, like the dragons, accidentally discovered a way to connect to the demonic plane and were controlled? This was the most likely analysis at the moment, but Roddy still cautiously put a question mark on it. The specific situation still needs to be investigated. If this is wrong, there will be many detours in the future. So we still need to find more sources to confirm. The books you found in Wagra City didn't have any records. There are some, but the records mainly record the process of the Beastmen's invasion. After the fall of the capital, the High Elves struggled for a period of time before completely vanishing. In other words, the books left in Wagra City are only a short period of records. During this period of time, Roddy had a headache sorting out the information. However, he had also confirmed many things from these scattered information centers. After comparing them over and over, he suddenly raised his head. That's right, I forgot about the Holy Assembly. Holy Assembly? You mean those who came to Elson City to cause trouble? Yes. They claim to be descendants of the High Elves. Camilla said that all these years, they've been collecting things left behind by the High Elves from all over the world. If we're talking about understanding the High Elves, the Holy Assembly must be the one with the most detailed understanding. At this point, Roddy rubbed the space between his eyebrows. But the last time we entered the Helsinki Magic Tower, we killed most of them. Now we can only wait and see if they will jump into the trap in Wagra City. I remember you mentioned this before, May. You still don't have any feedback? As soon as Kardashian finished speaking, the entire laboratory suddenly shook. A muffled sound came from outside the window. It was obvious that Iskar's laboratory had messed up again. These people are really stupid. Roddy didn't comment on his first wife's complaint. He continued the previous topic. I've actually moved the ruins of Wagra City a long time ago. What's in there now is fake information. Mercenaries have already explored this place, but according to the tracking results of the intelligence department, it seems that the fish hasn't taken the bait yet. That's really boring. I was thinking of going to Lashiman to take a look after this, Kardashian said casually. Roddy blinked. She wants to go to Lashiman? Then if Merlin Sarah finds out about me and her swallowing, Roddy felt that this matter was still far away. It was more reliable to think about other things first. He said, let's go down and see how much more they've blown up. When the two arrived at the laboratory, they saw the dragons cleaning up the wreckage with their faces covered in dirt. The laboratory was reinforced by a barrier. This scale of explosion did not affect the structure of the tower. However, the four dragons were arguing about the internal structure of the rocket. All right. The biggest problem right now is not the structure, but the materials. Let's first develop high-strength materials that can withstand high temperatures. The current structure, to be honest, it's already optimized to the limit. There's not much point in changing it. Kardashian was much more knowledgeable than them. After all, the physics and chemistry she learned on Earth was not for nothing. After she pointed out the problem, the other four dragons finally calmed down. Sigh, I knew it was the problem with the materials. Now we have to make a sample. Just choosing suitable steel takes a long time. Rubens was holding a pile of discarded steel plates in his hands. There were some black marks on his face, probably caused by the explosion just now. Iskar picked up a few broken pieces of metal from the ground. The traces of melting and cracking were very obvious. Everyone agreed with what Kardashian said. After all the optimization done by the four dragons in the past few days was to make up for the lack of strength of the materials, but now it seemed that they had put the cart before the horse. Chapter 935. Iskar turned to look at Roddy and asked, "What do you think, Prime Minister? Materials science is very important for the military. I agree that we should lay a solid foundation for now." Roddy said one thing after another, but he was secretly delighted. The dragon's research and development efficiency was much faster than Elson's magic research department. In other words, Roddy's strongest research and development department was no longer in Elson, but in Hersino Magic Tower and the dragons in the Dragon Tower. The other dragons did not feel that they were being used. Iskar was eager to try. He raised his hand and tidied up the test bench in front of him with magic. Then what are we waiting for? Let's start with heat resistance. Seeing that they were developing the properties of metals with great enthusiasm, Roddy said a few polite words and left the laboratory. The development of such basic materials was actually very boring. Even the dragons could not avoid a lot of repetitive experiment. I hope I can find the right formula before I get tired of it. As Roddy thought so, he went downstairs and walked around the middle-level administrative office area. The temporarily selected officials were here to deal with the information submitted from all over the country. At present, the most capable people in this kingdom were not the nobles, but their stewards. Therefore, these stewards became the main members of the first batch of civil servants. He glanced at them casually and was about to practice archery after confirming the efficiency of these people. Suddenly, someone from the intelligence department came to report a piece of news. Rowling wanted to take the civil servant screening exam. Rowling was the daughter of Charles II and used to be the princess of this kingdom, but now she was just an ordinary girl from a civilian family. After the coronation, the royal family was pardoned and did not have to live a hard life. Roddy gave them a piece of land and also assigned the servants who had stayed in the palace to the end as servants. The land was farmed, and their food and clothing were taken care of. As long as they did not lie down and wait for death, their future life would never be worse than that of the local small nobles. Of course, their family lived under the surveillance of the intelligence department. As long as they behaved themselves, Roddy guaranteed that they could live a stable life. If they plotted something else, he would not be polite. In the past few months, the intelligence showed that they did not have the guts to do anything. Charles II lived a befuddled life, while the Queen and her sons were independent, and Rowling worked harder than the others. Now, in order to recruit talents, Roddy began to test the waters with the civil servant exam that was still in the experimental stage to screen suitable civil servants. This method was simply unheard of for most people, so most people had a wait-and-see attitude and did not actively sign up. Roddy was not in a hurry. After all, Chimu Lee-sin had to go through a process. However, he did not expect Rowling to stand up and sign up. Her identity was very sensitive. However, it was precisely because of this sensitivity that Roddy immediately replied after a short moment of hesitation, "Do not interfere and ensure her safety." While Roddy was thinking about governing the country, Linny's village in the silent forest was like another world. Unlike the spacious and comfortable wooden houses in Elsa Village, this village retained the traditional treehouse structure of the Wood Elves. The Wood Elves all wore simple clothes. In November, the weather was getting colder. Many of the Wood Elves' faces were blue from the cold wind, and they could not stop trembling when they spoke. However, the villagers did not look worried. When Brody visited some time ago, he had left a lot of food and dried meat. If they ate sparingly, it would be enough for them to survive the winter. Moreover, the hunting team in the village was not what it used to be. The young Wood Elves who used to return empty-handed would now return with a full harvest. Sometimes, they would even bring back the carcasses of large predators, such as tigers and leopard. Remember, the only thing that can save us is us, the Wood Elves. Chief Body was lecturing the young hunters in front of him. The latter's expressions were firm as they answered loudly, "Yes, you are the strongest warriors. Do not fear any enemy." With that, the hunting team packed up the day's harvest. Chief Body returned to his treehouse. He was a dozen years younger than Brody and did not look old. After entering the house, he pointed at a simple wooden magic circle in the center of the house, and it lit up with a bright blue light. Upon closer inspection, one could see that there was a small magic crystal embedded in the wooden magic circle. Under the illumination of the light, the black tomes in the wooden house were especially eye-catching. "Only power is eternal." He mumbled something in the High Elf's tongue under his breath, then flipped through a notebook on the bedside table. It was their arrogance that led to their failure. "Now we will not be like this." Chief Body's expression was very solemn. He bowed as if he was going through some kind of ceremony. Then, he began to read carefully. In the process, he continued to practice spells. However, the spells that Chief Body was using now were no longer the natural magic that he used to control. All the spells were condensed and dissipated with a faint blue light. After practicing for a few hours, Chief Body walked out of the wooden house. The hunting team had finished processing the game, and the rich smell of meat wafted through the village. It was only when Body said it was time for dinner that the families began to eat. Not long after, other wood elves came to visit the village. These were wood elves from the nearby villages who had come to learn. They brought food and some iron ore as payment. Then, these 7 or 8 youths joined the original hunting team and began to learn magic under Body's guidance. Boom! Explosions sounded one after another. The wood elves who had only learned magic for a few months looked calmly at the shattered wooden targets. The splinters flew dozens of feet away, and when they fell to the ground, the smell of burnt flesh was extremely pungent. Remember, this is power. The power that you control in your own hands. Chief Body held a magic crystal that was emitting power. There were many cracks on the surface of the crystal. Normally, a magic crystal in such a state would explode. However, in his hands, the originally violent and unstable energy seemed to be tamed. Under his control, it became an element that was at his command. We must be prepared to receive spiritual attacks at any time. Grit our teeth and endure it. Only then can we survive in this world. Otherwise, we are no different from pigs. It was obvious that Chief Barty did not come up with his own words, for the word pig was in the High Elven language. The 20 or so young wood elves responded loudly with excited expressions. At the same time, they trained even harder. These magicians' apprentices could now cast spells skillfully. They did not learn low-level spells such as dust-raising spell or magician's hand. Now, all they used were offensive spells with considerable power. Wooden targets were placed in a row on the ground. The wood elves dressed in simple clothes looked solemn as they chanted spells loudly. At the same time, they released the dissipating energy from the magic crystal in their hands. After a round of bombardment, the ground that was originally filled with vegetation was now scorched black. Not a single blade of grass grew. Magic crystal was a rare item, but here, everyone had one. It was as if they did not lack money at all. Chapter 936. The dragons did not have a specific concept of the mechanics mentioned by Roddy, so their questions were somewhat scattered. Roddy was not afraid to be a physics teacher and said patiently, "In fact, if you are fast enough, the heat generated by the friction of air resistance can even ignite objects. I don't know if the dragons can reach this speed, but the faster the speed, the greater the air resistance that needs to be overcome. Everything is relative. I can understand a little if you put it this way, because the faster you fly, the harder it is to accelerate." Roddy, then do you think the crystal cannon can be infinitely enlarged? If we make a super large cannon barrel, can we blow up a target hundreds of kilometers away with one shot? Iskar was more interested in weapons, but Roddy nodded. If there are enough materials, it is not a problem to make a huge cannon that can bombard a target thousands of kilometers away, but that is only in theory. How many materials will be consumed to make such a huge crystal cannon? How much crystal energy will be consumed for one shot? Roddy said to the crystal dragon beside him, "Eshin, can you do me a favor? Use your illusion to simulate a sand table around the royal city." "No problem." Eshin raised his hand and a sand table formed by illusions appeared in the center. Roddy used his own magic to build a crystal cannon model. Iskar looked at its size and suddenly slapped his head. "If we really make this, the 5 dragons will not be able to fire a few shots even if they take out all their resources." "Yes, but there are actually many solutions for long-range and even super long-range attacks. If you are interested, you can participate." Roddy's seemingly casual words immediately made the eyes of the other 4 dragons light up. You can tell us?" "Of course, even if the demons do not invade this plane, we will fight our way there sooner or later." Roddy raised his hand and used magic to build a rocket model while saying to them, "With a super long-range attack weapon, after invading the demonic plane, we can directly shoot a few hundred shots at the demon lords. Who can withstand it? By then, the credit for killing the demon lords will probably be on you." "How? Don't keep me guessing." Black Dragon Herlo Rubens was obviously tempted. However, Roddy took out a stack of paper from the side and said, "This matter, if we are going to do it, let's do it together. All of you are the young talents of the dragons. But I believe that within the clan, there must be many who are eyeing your position and want to replace you, right? Right now, this project is actually worthless, but if we finish it in secret, the credit will belong to everyone. If you want to do it, it's best if we sign a confidentiality agreement to ensure that the research process will not be leaked to others." Roddy looked up at the dragons in front of him. They looked at each other and nodded. "Okay." Roddy tricked 4 dragons into joining the team while talking and laughing. Kardashian was really amazed by his ability. Akasha and Sally did not know how to describe it. They did not understand the principles of what Roddy said, but seeing the person they liked so freely in front of the dragons, the love in their eyes could not be concealed. The content of the confidentiality agreement was not much, but the 5 dragons confirmed the validity of the agreement by casting a spell together. After that, everyone went to the dining hall to eat. At this time, the newly joined Rubens and Stika also became more casual with each other. Because the agreement was not as simple as setting up a research and development team, it also established a circle and allowed them to have a deeper relationship with each other. Any race would have differences in intimacy and distance. Being tied to the 5 young talents of the dragons was very important to the stability of the entire regime. Although the ingredients for this meal were ordinary, the guests and the host enjoyed it. After Iskar and the others left, Kardashian, who quietly returned, yawned. "It's so tiring to act with you. Why did you suddenly think of dragging them to make a rocket?" "Ah? This thing is called a rocket?" Sally, who was holding a glass of warm water to sober herself up, turned her head curiously. "I listened to you for a long time, but I feel like a fool. I don't understand anything." "Me too." Akasha's alcohol tolerance was poor. At this time, her little face was red, and the way she leaned on the armchair was very seductive. Roddy gave her a cushion to use as a pillow. After helping the little priest lie down, he replied, "Actually, making a rocket is just a gimmick. The deeper purpose behind it is about resources." "Resources? You mean things like oil?" Kardashian had read a lot of information on Earth. She knew the general concept of things like the dollar, oil, and gold. And now, the recharged crystal was a kind of energy. In concept, it was similar to natural gas and fossil energy. If nothing went wrong, it would be the most common energy source for all races on the continent in the future. Yes, the recharged crystal can help the kingdom of Karen establish the hegemony of energy, but the technology of the recharged crystal will not be kept secret forever. This is a certain thing. Roddy was very clear that the larger the organization, the more complicated the personnel, the leakage was inevitable. Just like the mobile phone, if a company only relied on its capital, it would definitely go bankrupt in the future. Core competitiveness was the problem that Roddy, as a top ruler, needed to think about. The development of the rocket requires the support of a large number of crystals, and the problem of insufficient crystal energy. I can use the resources of the dragons to solve it. As soon as Roddy finished speaking, Kardashian reached out and poked his head. "Well, you even included me in your calculations. Tell me, what else haven't you said? How would I dare to plot against you? If I don't do this, the kingdom of Karen will fall into the hands of Charles II sooner or later. Everyone has to talk to each other on an equal footing to cooperate well. If someone falls behind, the one in front will not be polite." These words were said casually, but Sally next to him took it to heart. For the governance of the whole country, she could only learn from the previous feudal lord in fiefment. But now it seemed that the word centralization brought not only glory but also risks like walking a tightrope. Kardashian did not expect Roddy to think so far ahead. She could like Roddy personally and accept everything about him, but what the 5 dragons really cared about was strength and interest. However, at this time, the kingdom had just been unified, and it was time to celebrate the victory. Roddy had calmly begun to pave the way for the follow-up strategy. To become a person on equal footing with the dragons, he did not only rely on luck and strength. Divided for a long time, united for a long time, but united for a long time, divided for a long time. At this time, what I am most worried about is extreme prosperity will lead to decline. Roddy exhaled and looked at the night outside the window. This country needs at least 5 years to recover, and more than 20 years to restore the population. Well, then slowly recover. Now we have to think about, it's time to take a bath before going to bed. Kardashian dragged him to the bathroom. Sally and Akasha stared at the dragons, snatching him away. As the king, Sally felt that she could not be weak. 20 years is too long. You have to tell me if there is any way to speed up the process. She gritted her teeth and chased after Sally. Akasha didn't want to wait here alone, so she stomped her feet and followed Sally with a blushing face. Kardashian did not care what they thought. She looked back and answered Sally's question with a faint smile. I know the answer. Building ships, exploring the sea, and colonizing. Colonizing? Sally asked doubtfully, but Kardashian did not continue to answer. She pushed Roddy into the bathroom. Sally, who was standing outside the door, turned to look at Akasha. The latter whispered, Why don't we wait? I am Duke. Oh no, I am the king now. I don't want to fall behind. She took several deep breaths. She wanted to take a step with a red face but did not dare. In the end, Akasha pushed her. If we wait any longer, she will succeed. So Roddy took a bath for nearly 3 hours. July 20th. The kingdom of Efta had gradually restored its peace. But for many remote areas, they still had no idea what happened in the kingdom in the past 2 months. The young Suval was looking at the sky in the shadow of a pile of straw, bored. He was biting a straw in his mouth, wondering if he should go to the river to eat some fish in the afternoon. But before he could get up, a distant rumble made him jump. In his field of vision, several huge objects appeared a kilometer away, seemingly slowly moving in his direction. Suval immediately thought that it was a powerful magic beast, so he quickly ran back to Todd village. This small village in the northeast of the kingdom had a total of 70 people. Because of the complicated terrain, the roads connecting to other villages were very difficult, so they didn't even know about the beastman's invasion last year. There's a magic beast. A big magic beast. Suval's report made the small village bustle. The village chief brought more than 10 able-bodied men with wooden sticks and iron tools to the front of the village. When they looked into the distance, they were immediately scared silly by the approaching giant beast. The huge body of the road construction puppet made the human figures look incomparably small. Usually, there would be casualties when dealing with a wild boar weighing more than 100 kilograms. How could they contend against something weighing more than a ton? Therefore, the village chief immediately ordered the villagers to prepare to flee. However, 3 engineers on horseback quickly dispelled their panic. Not only did they come to inform the villagers that the road was about to be repaired, but they also brought 6 bags of dried meat and honey as a greeting gift. Chapter 937. Using both carrot and stick was the only way to deal with villagers in the mountains. After the engineers dismounted, they went to the village chief and asked for the food to be distributed in person. This was naturally to prevent the food from being pocketed by a few people. The village chief had been the butler of the nearby Viscount Morak for more than 20 years. Later, he was banished here because of a mistake. Thus, when he saw the other party's forceful methods, his expression changed several times, but he ultimately agreed to distribute the food on the spot. Suval took 3 jerky and took a bite. The rich meaty fragrance almost made him swallow his tongue. He simply sat on the ground next to the village chief and just happened to hear the words of the engineer. After the road is repaired, the road to the other villages will be unobstructed. At that time, there will be people to guide you in farming, and the food output will at least double. Really? The village chief's eyes widened. That's great. We won't be able to pay the taxes this year. Pay taxes? Viscount Morak is already dead. Cough, 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 Suval choked on his saliva. He raised his head and found that the village chief's expression was similar to his own. The stubborn Viscount Morak was the last noble in the kingdom who was unwilling to swear allegiance to King Sali I. The day before yesterday, he was reduced to ashes along with his personal guards. The kingdom of Karen is now completely unified, and your only overlord is King Sali I. Do you understand? In the future, there will be no more Viscount Morak. If the tax collectors don't come in the name of the kingdom's tax officials, then they must be fake. The engineers held several slips of paper in their hands, on which they recorded the things they wanted to announce. Suval looked at them enviously. In the entire village, only the village chief was literate, while the others were illiterate. Second, the kingdom has experienced war this year, and there are many things waiting to be done. In order to reduce the burden on the people, the cabinet has decided to exempt the outlying areas from taxes for an entire year. The words of the engineer made the people who were holding the jerky stare blankly for a moment before cheering in unison. Viscount Morak's taxes were too heavy in the past, and after paying the taxes, the people often had to endure hunger due to lack of food. They had to rely on picking wild fruits or catching small beasts in the wild all day long to satisfy their hunger. Now that the taxes were exempted, who wouldn't be ecstatic? The third thing is that the construction team is currently recruiting. Your village has 6 slots. If you want to sign up, you can register with me. Recruit what? The people who assist in the construction of the roads only need to be able to work in the field. They're not going out to fight. There is no more war. The engineer explained patiently. After joining the construction team, food and accommodation will be provided. If your performance is outstanding, you can join the official team and get paid. But when the village turned around and told the villagers, no one was willing to stand up. For these country bumpkins in the remote mountainous areas, going out was a very scary thing. They were ignorant and timid. When they heard the news of the tax exemption, they were already calculating how much food would be left this year. Who would go and do the unknown project? If no one signs up, it will be considered as giving up. The engineer didn't insist. Just as he was about to leave, Suval suddenly raised his hand and said, I want to go. We don't accept children. I'm 17. Suval summoned his courage and shouted. This made the engineer look at him before asking the village chief, Is he really 17 years old? Yes. Good, then go back and say goodbye to your family and follow us. The engineer never said any nonsense. You can have 3 days off every month, and you can come back to see your parents if you want. I don't have a family. Suval whispered. Got it. As the engineer's voice fell, the huge rumbling sounds of the road construction puppets were getting closer and closer. The villagers looked over and saw a smooth road extending from the horizon in the distance, making them feel as if they were possessed. As for Suval, he held the jerky in his hand and followed the engineer's footsteps towards the majestic construction team. He didn't know what was waiting for him, but he decided to go out and take a look. The Hersino magic tower eventually returned to Hollier City, but as the queen, Sally didn't change it to the Imperial City. In her eyes, the so-called Imperial Palace, Imperial City, and the newly promoted Lucifron family were only symbols without much meaning. After the kingdom was unified, it was still in the statistics stage, which was to calculate the kingdom's population, the structure of the rich and the poor, and various figures for analysis and formulation of subsequent national policies. The ruling methods of the cabinet were no longer as radical and swift as they were in EFTA. They had done that to buy time, but now that the kingdom was unified, time was the last thing they lacked. Everything was based on stability, and all policies had to be cautious. The affairs of the country were taken care of by the cabinet, so Sally was very relaxed. Now she studied divine spells all day and regularly performed purification treatment on the dragons in the magic tower. Compared to a month ago, Sally could now call out the names of all these dragons, and many dragons were willing to talk more with the king. Thus, Sally could be considered to have a lot of dragons as friends. When she came to the 19th floor today, Lord Quio was reading a book. Sally glanced at it and found that it was Elson's magic journal. There was a pen and paper on the desk next to Quio, and it was obvious that he was studying spells. She stepped forward with her scepter in hand. "Lord Quio, let me cast a purification spell." "Oh, okay." Quio had recovered from his initial depression and dispiritedness. Now his attitude towards Sally was very peaceful. He did not talk much, but he was not cold. He left the study and sat down calmly. Sally cast the spell very quickly, and it was over in a minute. After that, Quio nodded and thanked her. Sally could have left, but she glanced at the paper on which Quio had written a lot and asked curiously, "Are you studying human spells?" "Oh yes. There are a lot of things in the journal that need to be improved. I'm going to write them down and exchange them for some points." "Points?" Sally was stunned for a moment, and then she remembered that Roddy had specially set up a set of points system for the sanatorium. Points could be exchanged for various resources, including buying things, applying for the use of other half-planes, participating in the games in the entertainment area, or exchanging tokens for betting. She had thought that the dragons were not interested in these things, but now it seemed that Lord Quio seemed to be very interested in it. "The Red Dragon Team 1 is playing tomorrow. I have to exchange some tokens to place a bet. These little bastards always like to show off their skills when they play football. I've told them many times, but they don't listen." "Really?" Hearing Quio's words, Sally remembered that the male dragons in the entertainment area seemed to be very keen on the sport of football. They were 7 against 7, and after using spells to bind their strength, they would chase a crystal ball on a huge field. She had only heard of it, and it sounded childish when she thought about it. But the actual situation was far more popular than she had expected. "I'm the coach of the Red Dragon team, so I have to give them a lot of points as rewards. Otherwise, these little bastards will not be very enthusiastic." Quio looked very enthusiastic about this matter. He continued to mark the contents of the journal with the quill in his hand. "Help me ask Roddy. The Champions League final reward is only 5,000 points? Don't you want to add something else?" Okay." Sally walked out of the room in a daze. The once all-powerful Lord of the Dragons had now become a football coach who only wanted to win the championship. This contrast was a little hard for her to accept, but after a few steps, Sally suddenly realized the purpose of Roddy's system. Recuperation was not confinement. Although it was said that they could not leave the magic tower, there were so many half-planes in the magic tower that it was almost like another world. The dragons did not have to worry about being bored here at all. But if they were left to their own devices, it would be a complete waste for a group of powerful dragons to be idle all day long. A complete economic system was used to make the dragons more motivated. They gained the so-called points, but paid with precious knowledge and experience. In this way, the dragons' energy could be vented, and the papers they exchanged for points had invisibly provided immeasurable promotion and influence to the magic world in the kingdom of Karen. The dragons knew that they were being used, but they were happy to be used. Such a method made Sally admire Roddy's brain. When she pushed open another door, Lord Morlars was sitting with his legs crossed and looking at the poker cards in his hand. "You're here." "Yes." Lord Morlars, Let me cast purification. Okay. Morlars sat there alone. The cards in his hand were constantly shuffled, dealt, and floated horizontally in front of him under the control of the spell. After releasing the spell, Sally was puzzled and asked, "Are you studying cards?" "Yes, this game looks simple, but the mathematical meaning behind it always makes me feel that it is wonderful." She casually picked up a few cards. The hand-drawn patterns on them were very beautiful, but Sally did not understand what the mathematical meaning Morlars was talking about. Turning her head to take a look, Sally found a stack of papers and a book beside Morlar's hand. That was the book Roddy had asked her to briefly study before, Principles of Statistics. This book made Sally dizzy. She could not understand the various concepts in it, but she did not expect the former Lord of the Green Dragons to be interested in studying it. "I am verifying some of the content in this book, and at the same time, I am also studying whether good luck or good technique is more important." Morlars smiled and said, "It looks very simple, but it takes a lot of effort to find the optimal solution. The more I study this thing, the more interesting I find it. And that mahjong. There are indeed various reasons why these children are addicted to this game." Chapter 938. By the way, King Sally, ask them to bring me a few more periodicals when you're free. It's boring to just read magic. I want to read something else. I'll pay you the credit points. Morales pointed to the periodicals and newspapers on the wooden bookcase next to him. The newspapers of Karen's age for the last 2 months were listed there, and it was obvious that they were often flipped through. Sally had begun to feel numb to the word credit. She nodded in agreement and then left the 19th floor. When the monarch of the kingdom of Karen walked in the magic tower, the dragons she met on the way would greet her in a friendly manner. Seeing a green dragon that she was familiar with, Sally said, "Gloria, are you going to the entertainment area?" "Yes, are you going too?" Gloria was petite and looked like a little girl. She was wearing a dark green short-sleeved shirt and holding a bag of credit coins that were commonly used in the tower. Sally replied, "I want to see what you guys are playing. Are you going to watch the game?" "Yes, the force of nature is going to have a match today. I'm going to cheer for them. Our team is Rock Force." "Oh, that's the team of Black Dragon Hurlo." Sally followed her into the demiplane of the entertainment area, and found that it was divided into many areas. When the sanatorium was first opened, no one came here at all, but now it seemed that all the dragons were here. A group of dragons was warming up in the football field. Because there was a barrier in the field to ensure that they did not use their magic ability, everyone was sitting in the seats outside and watching. Gloria took her to the stands, and then Sally followed the group of dragons to watch the whole game. Although dragons could not use magic, their physical fitness and skills were definitely among the best, so the game was very enjoyable to watch. There were more than 20 dragons watching, and everyone's cheers were louder and louder. In the end, Gloria bet on the Green Dragon team to win, so she got the 1.2 times the odds of the points coins. Excited, she took Sally to play mahjong. After Gloria won a few rounds with her good luck, Sally could not help but play a few rounds. However, her calculation ability was obviously not as good as the dragons, and she lost several rounds in a row. Just as he was feeling disheartened, he suddenly relied on his luck to make a clean sweep and made a huge profit. Gloria cried out excitedly, and Sally was so nervous that her palms were sweating. At this moment, she finally experienced the thrill of these games. Her mind was filled with the urge to play again. However, she eventually controlled this thought. After bidding farewell to Gloria, Sally held her scepter and went to the points exchange office. When she saw 3 or 4 dragons coming over with papers to apply for points, she was speechless. How did this guy come up with so many new ideas? In his impression, Roddy was a commander who was good at planning and was always looking for the best solution. But when he rose to the level of the Prime Minister, it was absolutely impossible to just plan. The regulations and implementation details of each policy were definitely not things that were born with knowledge. What Roddy implemented seemed to be mature plans that had gone through countless evolutions. And now, these games that the dragons were addicted to, Roddy was even more at his fingertips. He only provided a few ideas and venues, and the lord-level existence of the dragons could not help but use knowledge to exchange for worthless points coins. Perhaps only this kind of genius could make the kingdom of Karen truly strong. Walking out of the entertainment area and experiencing the excitement of the gambling game, Sally glanced at the magic clock in the tower and suddenly realized that there was an important meeting to attend in 10 minutes, so she hurried to the nuclear room on the 21st floor. After entering the door, the High Elf Edith was in a daze looking at a plan that had just been sent over in front of the table. Sally knew that Roddy usually did not let Edith participate in political affairs, but this seemed to be an accident. She walked over and asked, "What is this? What new ideas did he come up with this time?" Looking at the plan, Sally read aloud, "National Credit System and Currency? What does that mean?" "The Prime Minister asked me to read this plan and answer some questions. Speaking of which, it's mainly about the currency of the High Elves." Edith was clearly in a daze. Sally was a little confused. "What's wrong? Are you not feeling well?" "No. I just find it hard to believe that the Prime Minister knows so much. If the High Elves had such an economic system back then, how could—" She felt that she was talking too much and quickly stopped. She smiled embarrassedly and said, "The plan is here. Your Majesty, please take a look. There's a meeting later, right? I'll go and prepare the magic circle first." Sally looked at the plan curiously. The concepts in it made her full of doubts. Issue currency? Isn't it better to use gold coins? Why use this kind of low-cost paper money? Edith, who was adjusting the crystal wall, replied, "During the High Elves era, the country's currency was all gold coins. It was the hardest currency. Because gold was recognized as a rare metal, it had the right to be used as a currency. Later, with the development of magic crystal also became a currency similar to gold coins. However, it only circulated in the magic world and had little to do with the common people. At the same time, because magic crystal is of varying quality, there is no fixed exchange rate. The Prime Minister's plan is to issue a paper money that is not worth much and let the government of the Kingdom of Karen define its value." Define. Does that mean that the paper is worth how much I say it is worth? Sally was astonished. Wasn't he just messing around? But the more Edith thought about it, the more she felt that the paper money was powerful. She explained patiently, "So the value of the paper money comes from the country's credit. If a gangster on the street tells me that there is a piece of paper here that is worth 1 gold coin, I won't believe it. I won't believe it. But if the cabinet of the Kingdom of Karen tells me all this, I will choose to believe it." Just like how the Prime Minister was able to borrow a huge loan from Lassman for the war, he borrowed it because of EFTA's credit. Now that Eiffel had unified the Kingdom of Karen, the kingdom's credibility must be higher than before. With the rise of the kingdom's power, I'm afraid that this kind of paper money will not only circulate within the kingdom, but will also become a hard currency in Lassiman. Sally opened her mouth slightly and blinked her eyes. Let the people of other countries recognize the value of a piece of paper? It's hard to imagine. Edith had been thinking about it for a long time, so she had a general understanding of Roddy's intentions. These notes can actually be seen as commodities, similar to jewelry, bread, or art collections. It's just that it can be widely traded. Sally stood there and thought for a long time. Isn't it just issuing a currency that is more convenient than gold coins? But I think it will take a lot of effort to do it, and he also needs to set up the Central Bank of Karen. Bank. He told me about it before, but what is this central bank? Indeed, economic problems could not be explained in a few words. Let alone Sally, even Edith, who was very intelligent, could not see the wider sky behind the paper money. She also did not understand what the central bank would bring. However, the communication circle made Sally understand that she needed to go to the meeting. She tidied up her makeup and sat in front of the crystal wall. On the screen, the cabinet office in the Dragon Tower was already full of cabinet nobles. Roddy sat in the middle and looked at the crystal wall. The signal is fine. Your Majesty, let's start today's discussion. He was wearing a simple black suit, and there were several stacks of manuscripts on the long table in front of him. The kingdom's various statistics have been basically completed recently. We are currently facing a lot of problems, very serious. Because of the 2 wars, the population has suffered heavy losses. It will be fine if there are no natural disasters this year, but if there are any disasters, famine will be the first problem we have to face. Sally did not talk much in the meeting. She only occasionally asked questions, and after getting Roddy's answer, she did not say anything more. There were such meetings in the cabinet almost every day, and the issues discussed were very complicated. Because the kingdom was still in a state of extreme shortage of civil servants. Since power was centralized, how to control the huge kingdom in the hands of the cabinet was a very big problem. After the lords of the various territories expressed their allegiance to Sally I's rule, their future wasn't as simple as eating and drinking in their own territories. At this time, Roddy was talking about the specific implementation plan of agricultural reform. Because of Elson's early research and experiments, crops with more than 3 times the yield had now been cultivated. These seeds would be promoted to be planted all over the country in the future, and the ridge farming system would also replace the backward 3-garden system. The use of manure would also be gradually promoted. In the next 3 years, the food problem was at least expected to be solved. There was no objection within the cabinet. In fact, all the current cabinet decisions were basically put forward by Roddy and finally implemented after simple modifications. It was not because the other nobles did not dare to object, but because with their level of knowledge, they could not find any reason to object. Farming could get more food, so why not? Roads could bring more wealth to the country, so why not build them? Airplanes, ships, and armies were not to be mentioned. These 3 were currently firmly in the hands of Roddy, and the armies of the other nobles had been completely cancelled and ordered to be dismissed. Sodeler was currently stationed in the royal city, and a group of people were left in the Holy Cathedral, Hollier, and Elson. These 4 core cities occupied the 4 regions of the Kingdom of Karen and were collectively known as the 4 major war zones. Chapter 939. Several nobles in the cabinet used to think that they were excellent politicians, but their common sense of territorial governance seemed childish and ridiculous in front of Roddy. I've already said about the bank. In the future, all the banks will need to cooperate with the current trading companies in the Kingdom of Karen. This will pave the way for the issuance of paper money in the future. Roddy took a sip of water as he spoke. Every time he talked about these things, his mouth would dry up. Because people in this era lacked economic knowledge, many people could not even calculate the interest rate of loans, let alone bank loans and other related businesses. Fortunately, he was not here to popularize knowledge today. He had written down the relevant knowledge on paper and distributed it to the people. They could go back and figure it out by themselves. The most important thing for us now is to perfect the civil servant examination system. Roddy spoke in a serious tone about the key point of today's meeting. At the same time, we need to control all the speech, instill the contents of the cabinet decree from top to bottom. There is only one thing to promote in the future. Tell the people of the country that in the future, they will no longer be governed by nobles. As long as they are outstanding enough, they can become managers themselves. These words stunned all the nobles in the cabinet. Sally, on the other hand, sat there thoughtfully. After a few seconds, she asked, "Rhodey, do you mean to work hard to open up the path for the commoners?" "Yes." Roddy nodded and explained. Before this, the lords ruled separately, and the path up was completely controlled by the nobles. Only those who made military contributions or made great contributions could become nobles. But think about it, are all the nobles really good at management and administration? Prime Minister Roddy, even if many of the nobles are incompetent, but the civilians are illiterate, what do they know about administration? Earl Blake asked in a puzzled manner. Isn't it because the nobles monopolized the knowledge that the civilians are illiterate? Roddy raised his eyelids slightly. Is it difficult to read? It's not difficult, but why are so many illiterate? Because under the protection of most of the lords and nobles, only the nobles are qualified to learn this kind of knowledge. If the civilians want to learn, they have to pay an unbearable price. If humans want to develop, limiting the selection of the upper management to a small circle that isn't expanding is completely suicidal. His words caused several cabinet nobles to ponder. At their positions, they naturally saw more of it. Most importantly, they were all politicians, so they were more sensitive to the direction of the wind. One of them said, "Then what Prime Minister means is that ordinary people can even enter the cabinet in the future." The cabinet itself is a temporary product. It's not easy for the few of us to coordinate everything in the kingdom. But I'll answer your question now. Ordinary people, especially ordinary people with excellent governing skills, if their knowledge and actions can enhance the strength of the country, why can't they enter the core of the cabinet? Roddy pointed at himself. You know, I'm not a hereditary noble. No one dared to respond to this. After all, the bloodline theory still had some popularity in this era. Many old nobles, such as Lucifron, the descendants of the Founding Fathers, often looked down on those new nobles, not to mention the commoners who were born in the countryside. This sense of superiority was accumulated for hundreds of years of human development in this world. No one refuted Roddy's words because he had the ability to let everyone sit down and think about the essence of the problem, and not because he sat on the side of the nobles and mindlessly defended the interests of the class. Sally looked serious. She also knew that Roddy was right, but she couldn't accept it emotionally. So she asked a more pointed question for the first time. If ordinary people enter the cabinet in the future, then should they accept the title and become nobles? No, this is the point I want to say. We divide people into classes, and there's nothing wrong with that, because this kind of classification exists in any society. But the members of the management should not be restricted by class. What we need is smart people to manage, and it has nothing to do with their identity. If ordinary people can do it, then let ordinary people do it. There are smart people among the nobles, so why should we refuse? If, as your Majesty said, if we deliberately emphasize that only nobles can enter the management, then the civil servant assessment system has no meaning to implement. People will only try their best to become nobles, instead of learning the knowledge of the civil servant assessment. Roddy finally pointed to the round table in front of him. I hope that all of us consider the interests of the majority as the benchmark. Unfortunately, people tend to defend the interests of their own class. If I'm not here in the future, and all of you aren't here, will they still consider the livelihood of the people like they do today? That's right. That's right. The nobles frowned and thought about this question. In fact, before Charles II, the whole kingdom of Karen had begun to gradually degenerate. The biggest role of the nobles was to fight. The long-term peace made the nobles lose their will, and they indulged in pleasure all day long. The only bravery they had was used to kill each other. The biggest role of the monarch was to balance the scale of power among the nobles, and to ensure that they were in a ruling position. If this country continued to act like this in the future, then what was the point of cooperating with the dragons? What was the point of today's centralization of power? Sally could roughly understand what Roddy meant. She tentatively asked, "So, you want someone in the cabinet to always take care of the interests of the people at the bottom?" "Yes, Your Majesty." Roddy took a deep breath. In the past, he was just an otaku who played online games. However, the times make the hero. Now that he was in this position, he could understand the indescribable meaning of the political knowledge that he once disdained. The strength of the people determined the foundation of the lower buildings. Without the foundation below, the top buildings could only be castles in the air forever. It was impossible to erase the class gap between the top and the bottom. The only thing that could be done now was to work on the ideology. People will not betray their own class, no matter how smart or stupid they are. If we want this country to prosper for a long time, we must put the interests of the people at the bottom first. To be honest, it's easy at the beginning, but as time goes by, the people sitting here tend to be farther and farther away from the bottom. Roddy took out a table with the statistics of the crystal cannons in the Kingdom of Karen. Individually, we are not as strong as the dragons, but we can develop weapons that can deter the dragons. Who will develop them? They relied on smart people, people who were willing to work hard, and ordinary people who transported resources over. Without them, these things are just empty talk. The cabinet is now a governing body. My idea is to eventually establish a parliament with the cabinet as the core. But the parliament is divided into two. One is the House of Lords, which is made up of nobles, and the other is the House of Commons, which is made up of civilians. Members of the cabinet must be members of both the House of Lords and the House of Commons. As he spoke, he took out a diagram and began to distribute it to the members of the cabinet. This method was actually imitating the political system of the United Kingdom. After all, there were still countless nobles in the Kingdom of Karen. If they were directly deprived of all their power, they would definitely rebel. Therefore, the political system must maintain the class and group of nobles, but at the same time, it must also accommodate the participation of civilians. Although the beginning was bound to be difficult, this step was the foundation for the development of the whole kingdom. There was no room for compromise. Sally already had some understanding of the constitutional monarchy, so she was not surprised by the plan that Roddy took out at this moment. After reading it, the members of the cabinet also understood that the change in this kingdom was no longer about the ruler, but the complete political structure. Were they willing? In fact, the great nobles present were not fools. After careful consideration of Roddy's words, they could all confirm that this was the most reasonable solution for the long-term prosperity of the kingdom. If they were not willing, it was because they could not betray their own class and could not accept the substantial reduction of the nobles' power. Prime Minister, what does this Supreme Court mean? Isn't it included in the framework of the Parliament? Someone raised the question. Roddy explained, in the past, all the cases were decided by the Lord, but the result was that the crimes committed by the nobles often did not cost much, while the crimes committed by the civilians were often punished severely. In the long run, the accumulation of contradictions often led to bad consequences. Therefore, I hope that in the future, all the cases will be completely independent of other institutions, including the cabinet, the upper and lower parliament, and even Her Majesty Sally. In other words, if I commit a crime, I will also be judged by the Supreme Court. Neither Her Majesty nor any of you have the right to pardon my crime. Everything is subject to the judgment of the Supreme Court. Roddy's words surprised the members of the cabinet. They thought that the cabinet prime minister was already the pinnacle of power, almost above King Sally. They did not expect that Roddy was willing to take the initiative to create a department that hindered him. The monarch establishes the Constitution. The Prime Minister is elected by the majority group or party in the Parliament. The Cabinet is convened by the Prime Minister and can only be established after the approval of the upper and lower Parliament. The Supreme Court is independent of the monarch and the Parliament. These will be the three top powers of our kingdom in the future. This was not a separation of three powers. In fact, most of the powers still belonged to the Parliament. However, this had completely taken a big step forward from the backward feudal system. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.